Lee Seaman had a strange vision that turned his whole life upside down. Although the young man did not immediately understand what step the stranger was talking about, the man explained that for some, the step would be nothing. But for others, it could cause them to fall off a cliff, and therefore it was necessary to remember that a word was enough to stop a person at the precipice. Looking at our hero, the stranger tried to convince him that he was not a coward. Listening to these words, tears glistened in the young man's eyes. Stunned by this, Lee Seaman did not know how to respond to such a remark, but he understood that things would never be the same again. Ever since monsters began to appear in the world, people had divided into raiders and everyone else. A little nervous, the young man went to the raider's office after a while, hoping for something. One of the administrators standing behind the counter invited our hero into the office. Lee Se-min, clutching his hands in fear, said in a quiet voice that he understood everything, although in reality he had no idea what lay ahead. Timidly entering the office, the young man knew that in order to become a raider, he had to pass a qualification test, and only those awakened with an aura above a certain level had the right to become full members. In an indifferent tone, the employee said that this was not his first visit, so she would not waste time explaining how the test worked. After that, the girl asked if the young man was aware that he would be going into the army in a year, adding that he had been using the raider test as an excuse, but that this trick would no longer work. In the same indifferent tone, the girl continued, noting that she knew about Lee Seaman's situation, but that it couldn't go on forever. She then asked if the young man wanted her to write him a referral to a psychologist. Hearing that the young man had said he would take the tests, the employee reiterated that he would not be able to get out of it next year. Sitting in a room, the young man didn't want to think about anything. He felt extremely depressed and useless. Only a few minutes passed, and the young woman noted that the test subject's score, as in the previous year, was 103. Everyone knows that the aura values of all awakened individuals start at the same level and then slowly increase. But the young man's value had not changed since he learned that he was awakened. Lee Seaman thought wistfully that he had been training hard all this time, but then he simply realized that he did not have the talent to become a raider. The reason was that his aura value had not changed, meaning there was no progress, so there was no point in continuing. At that moment, the girl handed the client a document and asked him to sign at the bottom, adding that they had already completed all the tests. The young man once again immersed himself in his own thoughts about how he had once truly believed that he would achieve his goal. Our hero thanked them aloud for giving him the opportunity to take the test again, although he thought about how reality had slapped him in the face. In the evening, when he returned home, the guy carefully opened the front door. It was dirty inside, but it seemed that our hero was not bothered by this at all, because he was lost in his own thoughts. Turning on his computer, Lee Seaman said aloud that today was the perfect day to play games, but then froze in surprise. A notification appeared on the screen stating that the young man's right to participate had been verified, although he did not understand what that meant. After entering the Transcendental Network, the young man saw a list of participants and a list of special participants in front of him, although he did not fully understand where this site came from. Realizing that he needed to figure everything out, Lee Se-min immediately clicked on the participant board. The computer displayed a whole list of different people with a huge number of skills, although the young man still did not understand what it all meant, or how the list could help him. Smiling, our hero thought that there were probably other fools with 8th grade syndrome. After reading the story of a certain Mr. Dam Wuguan, the young man said that he was sure that the words of a wise man would help him and bring him back to the real world. The guy was reading something enthusiastically on the website when he suddenly read about the sound of someone's parents' necks breaking, after which he began to laugh at it. The young man wrote that it was enough to live like parasites at the expense of others, and on recommendation, he decided to go outside and get some fresh air, thinking that after his words, the man seriously reflected on his life and slammed his hand on the table. The young man was angered by the news that An Sung-joon had achieved platinum status, despite the fact that they had once seen each other face to face every day, and this unpleasant individual had mocked our hero. However, now it didn't matter, because his tormentor had already achieved platinum status, while the young man was still sitting in his small apartment in front of his computer screen. Approaching the board, Lee Seaman took one of the stickers in his hand to tear it off. Holding the piece of paper in his hands, he said with anger in his voice that it all made him angry and annoyed. A moment later, he clenched the small piece of paper in his fist and shouted loudly that he was angry at everything that was going on around him. Pulling himself together a little, the young man decided to reopen the website to read something again. Our hero said aloud that he was a loser, that he had dropped out of school to become a raider, and now he was a keyboard warrior, a couch critic who couldn't pass the qualifying test. And again, the young man saw a message on the screen saying that his right to participate had been verified. With an angry smirk, the irritated guy said he didn't understand why the site had reopened, and wished the all-knowing Kim Bon-hak to be polite. After that, his friend sent him a series of messages, but this did not calm the young man down at all. On the contrary, he laughed, saying that some crazy person was writing to him. The young man was so used to computers and online arguments that he didn't care at all. On the contrary, he shouted that he was not afraid of anything, and that he wanted this person to find him, unaware of what was going on behind his back. Lee Seaman repeatedly declared that if only this newcomer would come across him, he would definitely deal with him. However, at that moment, something happened that the guy did not expect at all. A voice behind him asked what he would do if they met. The girl, who had appeared out of nowhere, looked intently at the young man but did not dare to say anything. Then she asked the stunned apartment owner if he was really unemployed. Not knowing what to say, the guy growled, not understanding what was happening to him and where this strange stranger had come from in his home. A moment later, our hero noticed that a snow-white portal had appeared in front of him. And at that moment, the girl was no longer standing in front of him, but hovering. However, she easily descended back to the ground to be closer to the young man. The stranger said that she was curious to see what the young man was like, adding that everything turned out to be different from what she had expected. A minute later, the blonde fell silent, seemingly watching the guy's reaction closely and waiting for something from him. However, he, in turn, watched everything that was happening, as if trying to automatically cover his eyes with his hands from everything he saw in front of him. But what happened a moment later surprised Lee Se-min even more. As some kind of ropes wrapped around his entire body, the girl felt as confident as possible. So she asked the guy why he was shouting and why he was behaving so inappropriately. The guy, who was now bound on all sides, could neither move nor speak, and he realized that he was completely helpless standing in front of the blonde. With irritation in her voice, the beauty said that he was a real weakling. But the girl continued to stand her ground, declaring that the guy wasn't even good enough to be an insect. And, among other things, she had no idea how he got into the Transcendental Network. The next minute, the blonde lifted our hero up to the ceiling, addressing him as if he were a fat man, and asked who he really was. Frightened, he said that if they let him go, he would gladly tell them who he was. But in his current state, he couldn't. Unraveling his shackles, the stranger continued to watch the young man, whom she did not like very much. Freed from his so-called captivity, the young man fell to the ground with a crash, then began to mutter something unpleasant under his breath. Responding to the guy's questions, the beauty said that her name was Iana. After that, the beauty smiled and noted that the young man was a real liar, not understanding why he was telling everyone that he was a raider. Embarrassed, the young man began to justify himself, explaining that it was true. But the fact was that he was a mage, not a full-fledged raider, but he was not lying. Our hero explained that in this world there are ordinary people and raiders with auras, and it is they who usually hunt monsters, and he is an awakened one with an aura. A moment later, Iana asked the guy to demonstrate his aura to make sure he wasn't lying. Lee Se-min was nervous, his whole body was shaking, but despite this, he found the strength to show what he was capable of. The girl watched closely and asked with a hint of mockery in her voice if that was all the guy was capable of. While he was trying to understand what she meant, the blonde covered her face with her hands in despair. After pausing for a moment, the beauty asked if it was really true, or just a joke, although she herself leaned toward the latter option. Realizing that Lee Se-min didn't understand something, the guest began to gather mana around herself to show the man what she was capable of. This had a strong effect on our hero, who couldn't believe what he was seeing. The beauty was indeed surrounded by some kind of irresistible power that was unmatched, and it was a power that drew people to her. At that moment, Lee Se-min decided for himself that transcendents were monsters. Cowering and wailing, the young man begged his new acquaintance not to touch him or kill him. At that moment, a voice came from the hallway. Someone was talking about an earthquake and asking how the guy was feeling, to which he shouted that he was fine. Covering her face with her hand again, Iana began to scold herself for wasting the points she had worked so hard to accumulate because of the loser standing right in front of her. Angrily, she began to shout about how the guy managed to get into the Transcendental Network, although he calmly explained that he had simply turned on his computer. The beauty had never seen anything like it, so she thought to herself that this thing looked too strange, although she realized that it was most likely a means of communication in her world. The stranger wanted to know much more, but the young man timidly told her that he didn't know what else he could tell her. The girl was not going to give up, so she began to ask what else the guy could tell her, but only about himself. Raising his hands, the young man assured his new acquaintance that there was nothing interesting in his life. He had simply gone through a lot of trouble and ended up here, finding a more or less clean place for herself. Iana stated the fact that our hero had brought himself to the point of turning his own life and his own home into a pigsty. Lee Se-min heard the blonde call him a pathetic person, and said aloud that he knew it very well. The girl didn't want to humiliate him, so she remarked that he was probably trying to change something in his life. The blonde really wanted to believe this, so she asked her question again with determination in her voice. The guy sat there, not knowing what to say, and no matter how cruel the words were, they didn't hurt him at all. On the contrary, the guy began to talk about how he became an orphan at an early age and was adopted by his current parents. He went on to say that he realized he was gay in school, but because of bullying, he was never able to finish. After a short pause, he recalled how he ended up in front of a laptop, where he literally sat for days on end. Finally, it was Lee Se-min's turn to talk about his aura readings, which had remained unchanged for 6 years. Feeling a little sad, the blonde said that it was the saddest story ever. And upon hearing this, their host agreed with her. Suddenly, Iana proudly announced that it was time for her to leave. However, before leaving, the guest said that her new acquaintance should remember that if he wrote nasty things again, she would come and kill him. But before that, he had to write an apology. Returning to the portal, the blonde paused for a moment because she remembered something. With sadness in her voice, she added that the world is very diverse, cruel, and unfair, as many people know. Despite this, young people still have to go out and start doing something. And since they are human beings, people should live, not just exist. Stammering, Lee Se-min asked fearfully if they could ever meet again. Laughing, the blonde said that absolutely anything was possible, but only if the young man managed to become transcendent. Getting up from the floor, the young man thought that he simply had to face his own fears head-on. Holding a small ornament in his hands, the guy asked himself if he would ever be able to become the raider he had always seen in his dreams. Realizing that he had to move on, the young man first went back to his laptop and wrote an apology. For the first time that evening, Lee Se-min did something that made him feel good about himself. The guy wrote that he was an unemployed young man who bowed his head to all his sisters and brothers from a transcendental network. It must be said that since then, viewing this network has become an integral part of our hero's life. Seeing the photos of Cayenne, the guy happily exclaimed that this was great, since this young man had not shown anything for quite some time. Everyone knew the Dark Lion Cayenne, many liked him, and many admired him. This man was born into a family of a nobleman and a slave. After his mother was killed by an aristocrat, the guy used his sword skills to become a mercenary. Then he exterminated all the aristocrats and became the most powerful master on the continent. Seeing a photo of the young man and his wife, our hero decided that these people were somehow similar to each other. The young man pondered what a family photo was, even though he himself had stopped calling his parents, when the system sent him a notification. It was a message from a man everyone called the Ghost Blade Fergan. Lee Se-min knew very well that this was one of the best swordsmen he admired. Our hero thought to himself that this man was like an older brother to him, and therefore it was very easy and comfortable for him to communicate with him. Sitting at his computer desk, the guy said aloud that for some reason his side had been hurting a little lately, and he didn't understand what could be the cause. At this time, Lee Se-min advised the sword heroes that it would be best to start with an emotional message and ask the girl where her wings had gone. You could also say that the young man mistook the beauty for an angel, which should also be pleasant for her to hear. And when the beauty smiles, you can simply say that her smile makes your heart beat much faster. At the very end, the guy added that you can't stop there. You have to keep going until she finally reciprocates. The grateful young man enthusiastically replied to the young man, saying that as soon as he collected the required number of points, he would definitely visit him. The guy was pleased to hear this, but he didn't fully understand what the word visit meant. Could it be that someone would come to see him again? Lee Se-min noted to himself that in his interactions with transcendents, he had noticed one characteristic trait, which was diligence. They never put off what they had to do. For some reason, these people always kept their promises, did not look for excuses, and did not run away from their responsibilities. Sitting on a chair, the young man frowned sadly and acknowledged the fact that, compared to them, he was just an ordinary slacker with so much free time. And looking at his own hands, the young man decided that he should, however, face the truth instead. Bowing his head, the young man quietly said that he could not become a raider, and that it was time for him to leave. Opening the refrigerator, our hero found a bottle of alcohol there, and decided that now was the best time to drink something strong. Lee Se-min did not intend to pour the drink into a glass. He wanted to drown his sorrows, so he began to drink straight from the bottle, and quite quickly at that. Falling onto the bed, the guy started talking to himself again about his life and everything that had happened to him before. The young man, addressing no one in particular, asked why he even needed to give off an aura if it was of no use. All his life, he had thought that one day he would become an excellent raider, and had never seen any other path. He lived for his goal. The hero wanted to achieve his goal at any cost and, so to speak, prove to himself that he had not made a mistake in his choice. The guy was hurt and upset, but he wanted to show everyone that he wasn't the loser they always thought he was, someone who could be made fun of. Despite this, he was stuck at 103, and this value had not changed for a long time, which meant that there was no progress in his development. Continuing to reach forward, Lee Se-min complained that he couldn't even get out of bed easily and quickly. Finding the strength to do the nearly impossible, the young man reopened his laptop and went to his usual website. In a moment, there was already a discussion on the forum about how the guy was unemployed and wanted to change. However, instead of getting up and doing something, the young man picked up the bottle again and took a few sips. He just wanted to press the button to send his message so that all the raiders would hear it. After that, the young man lay down on the table, but it was unclear whether he was going to sleep or just lying down, thinking about something. Time passed, but nothing changed, as Lee Se-min continued to lie on the table and do the same thing. A few hours later, the young man suddenly jumped up and began to scold himself for falling asleep, even though he had not intended to do so. Staring intently at the screen, he berated himself for posting something while drunk that he hadn't even intended to. Grabbing the mouse, the guy immediately began searching for his latest messages to check what he had written, since he couldn't remember it when he was sober. Staring intently at the screen, our hero just sat silently for a while. To the young man's great surprise, there were many comments under his post about how life is short, and that, at the very least, you should go outside to start something. Lee Se-min did not expect things to turn out this way, so he reread the messages over and over, thinking about what to do next. The guy started thanking everyone for their advice, not realizing that he was no longer alone in the room. At that moment, an unfamiliar voice behind him asked if our hero was the unemployed guy. The young man, who had already gone through something similar once, did not want to face it a second time, so he did not dare to turn around and face the truth. The young man also thought that this time the voice was so sharp that it sounded like sharpened metal. Lee Se-min realized that it was most likely one of the Transcendents, but why he approached him was unclear. Perhaps the guy would never have decided to turn around, but the stranger lightly touched his back, causing our hero to jump up and scream loudly. Meanwhile, the man continued to evaluate the young man, saying that he was helpless, depressed, with weak, cursed intuition that was corroding his mind and body. Crying, the guy couldn't understand what was happening to him, but he clearly understood that it felt as if a huge number of snakes were biting his body at the same time. The voice, addressing Lee Seaman, proudly declared that he should not even think of sticking his neck out. Our hero turned toward the stranger and was about to say something, but he couldn't. The young man wanted to strike with his clenched fist, but he was in such a state that he couldn't do it. At the same time, the stranger declared that it turned out the guy hadn't given up completely. Our hero stood motionless, but the uninvited guest repeated his name over and over again, as if he wanted to say something extremely important. Suddenly, the young man found himself in a very strange place. He realized that there was water beneath him, but for some reason, he did not fall down. Looking around, the young man tried to collect his thoughts and understand where he was and what this could be. The stranger explained that he was the best transcendent hunter of all time. He added that Lee Seaman did not seem to be a weakling, although Lee had a completely different opinion of himself. The surprised young man heard that he was repeatedly called a strong personality, but as it turned out, he himself could not believe it. After a moment, the young man finally smiled, seeming to understand the meaning of all these words. The man continued to explain that the world was governed by certain laws, and he considered Ian to be very strong, but the power of this transcendent being was beyond comprehension. Therefore, he stated that the young man must collect points to gain access to the hint board, where a person could leave a message for him. Lee Seaman stretched out his hand and shouted something. Realizing that he did not understand the meaning of all these words at all, and therefore wanted clarification, the young man asked again and again to stop. But at that very moment, he fell to the floor of his apartment. As he got to his feet, it seemed to him that it was all just a bad dream because he had fallen asleep at the table. The next moment, our hero noticed a scratch on his arm and reached for it. Clenching his fist, Lee Se-min noticed that it hurt a lot and felt unpleasant. At that very moment, like a bolt from the blue, our hero remembered that he considered himself weak and imagined himself to be so. For several minutes, the young man stood there, not knowing what to do or where to go next. It turned out that he couldn't believe that all this had really happened to him. Looking ahead, the young man thought about how, for some reason, he suddenly felt lighter than ever before. Looking at his apartment, the young man decided that now was the best time to tidy up a little. After a while, clutching his back, the guy was happy that he had done everything he could and that the cleaning was finished. Lee Se-min was in no hurry to go anywhere, so he raised his hands and stared at them as if he had never seen them before. With a hint of sadness in his voice, the young man thought that there was only one piece of trash left in this apartment, hinting at himself and his presence. Glancing at his board, the young man decided that he must always remember his encounter with the Transcendentals. As he buttoned up his tracksuit jacket, the young man decided that those words were extremely important, so they should always be on his mind. A short time later, our hero was standing in front of the door, about to open it. Opening it, the young man told himself that he did not consider himself weak. He was a person who did a lot. Returning home, the guy first of all threw himself on his food, chewing it with such energy as if he hadn't eaten for several weeks. Looking at the empty chicken box, the guy thought to himself that he couldn't believe he was so hungry after a 10-minute run. However, he began to scold himself for such inappropriate behavior, deciding that he shouldn't act that way. Lee Se-min decided to pull himself together, but instead he just ate his fill because he told himself he needed to go for another run. It was a difficult test that the young man found hard to pass, as he was leaning on buildings rather than running. He thought to himself that it would be difficult for him alone, and he had always been aware of this. Not much time had passed, and Lee Se-min was already standing near the gym, which he had read about in an advertisement just recently. Timidly opening the door and clearing his throat, the guy asked if anyone was inside and if the facility was open. However, the guy's face suddenly changed dramatically when he saw something completely unusual. In front of him was a strong man who was easily lifting a barbell that was scary to even look at. Our hero noticed this, realizing that in order to achieve such a result, one must train hard and diligently. The man did not respond to this, saying only that he had never seen the young man in the gym before. Receiving no answer, the stranger asked if the young man had come here to work out and get in shape. He immediately told the young man that he was very happy to meet him, and said that his name was Kim Dok-bae, after hearing our hero introduce himself in response. The man said that he immediately understood why the young man had come here, because he had smelled something. Looking Lee Se-min in the eyes, the coach asked how long it had been since the young man had eaten chicken. He then continued, saying that the young man had decided to start exercising today, did a few exercises, and decided to reward himself with the chicken he had ordered, adding that he did not like this approach. Taking our hero by the hand, the man said that the young man needed to warm up first, and then, raising his voice, said that since he had come here, he needed to start today. Kim Dok-bae watched the young man's reaction closely, as if he wanted him to understand the true meaning of his words. Taking the young man's hand again, the man said he was sure that the young man had played sports before, hearing a satisfactory answer. Encouraging Lee Se-min, the coach continued to point out that the young man had the basics and just needed to work hard on his body. Only a few minutes had passed, and our hero was already running on the treadmill, and judging by his appearance, it was a real challenge for him. Responding to the coach's question, the young man said that he was tired and that it was time to take a break. But instead, the man yelled at the young man to fall down, then get up again, then fall down again, and what's more, he had to learn this once and for all. Lee Se-min, who did not expect such an approach, sweaty and exhausted, tried to say something, but he did not have the strength, As he continued to run, the young man thought about how he could no longer go around in circles, how he had no aura, and how his pride was gone, leaving him with nothing. The coach couldn't read minds, but he saw the young man's efforts, so he told him to keep going, adding that if the young man felt he was on the verge of early death, he should still move forward. After training, trembling, Lee Saemin said aloud that he felt like he was about to die there because he couldn't move anything. Kim Dokbai didn't care about that. He just smiled and said that he would be waiting for the young man tomorrow in the same hall. And looking after our hero, the man quietly said that he was a cool kid. And most importantly, he wasn't lazy and didn't give up. However, the guy, who had not yet left, heard these kind words and sincerely thanked the man for his support. Our hero thought to himself that it was at that moment that he felt the long-awaited taste and desire for something. In the evening, sitting at his computer, the guy wrote that today, for the first time ever, he had taken the first, and most importantly, real step in his life. At that moment, Lee Saemin remembered something the best demon hunter had told him, and going to the appropriate section, he noted that he should go to the hint, where he would find something interesting for himself. When he clicked on the button, he saw that access was denied because he didn't have enough points yet. Our hero was unhappy to read this. He wanted to familiarize himself with the hint as soon as possible, but did not know how to get the missing points. At that moment, the system sent him a quest, which said that the young man had to lose weight to 100 kilograms or less. Seeing this, the young man cried out, as he could not believe his eyes and did not understand how he would be able to lose weight to such a level, and possibly even less. The young man decided to move forward regardless, and continue toward his goal without giving up on his dream. The next day, while running on the treadmill, our hero thought that he would definitely lose weight, no matter how much effort and time it took. The coach saw the young man's determination, so he kept shouting at him not to stop and to keep running, even if he felt tired. After a while, Lee Saemin stopped, noticing something interesting that caught his attention. Looking at his reflection, the young man decided that in this short time, he had managed to lose a little weight, or at least it seemed that way. Encouraged by his reflection, the young man raised his hand, called himself by name loudly, and said that he would manage, because he needed to move on. The young man knew exactly what he wanted, so his training continued not only in the gym, but also in his everyday life. Strangers running by heard the young man talking aloud about his plans to do interval training. A girl who had met our hero before noted with surprise that he was running again. She remembered that when she first met Lee Saemin, he seemed rude and stubborn to her, but now he had changed a lot. And that was true, because our hero had shown a strength of will that he himself had not even suspected. Despite the fact that the horizontal bars were difficult for the guy, he was not going to give up on this idea, realizing that this was the only way he could build muscle mass. Again and again, our hero repeated aloud that he would not become stronger until he started working on himself. The guy remembered an interesting meeting with transcendentalists and told himself that he was not a coward or a weakling. Each new movement was a challenge to himself, which he had to not only accept, but also pass with dignity. The stranger heard the young man repeating to himself that he would fight to the end, even if he died. And she liked these words because they revealed his best qualities. Suddenly, when the beauty approached, it was clear that she wanted to say something. Finally, the young lady spoke to the young man, complimented him, and noted that he always trained hard. A moment later, she added that she had noticed the young man on his first day, and could now say with certainty that there were very few people with such ambitious goals. Lee Saemin was in no hurry to reveal all the details, so he simply said that it was time for him to go. The beauty looked at our hero with a scorching gaze, thinking to herself that she shouldn't have spoken to him at all. The guy thought to himself that this girl was most likely a raider, as he could sense her blue mark, or so it seemed to him. The physical abilities of raiders far exceed those of ordinary people, even if we are talking about low-ranking raiders. In addition, the huge rewards they received for risking their lives created a sense of privilege. The young man knew this firsthand, so he had an idea about such things. He remembered how once, senior members of the profession saw him and shouted at him to go home, because he would never achieve anything but a blue mark. Everyone knows that even among raiders there is an insurmountable wall. Therefore, everyone understands how different raiders are from ordinary people who have no abilities. Lee Saemin strove forward with all his might, but at that moment, his new acquaintance, who had caught up with him, said she was going to overtake him. A moment later, the beauty maliciously called the young man fat and looked at him with a certain carelessness. And to hurt the young man even more, she wished him luck, but added that even that wouldn't help him. After a while, the guy returned home, realizing that his training was probably over. Approaching the computer, our hero became curious about who had posted something online. And a moment later, he noticed a message from Yana. The young man thought to himself that at first this girl seemed extremely scary to him, but over time he realized that she was sweet and even affectionate. The most interesting thing was that she was on a completely different level. That being the case, the guy decided that his main task now was to concentrate on the quest, especially since at that moment the system sent a notification that a new task was waiting for our hero. But before that, he had to be weighed, which he was so afraid of and prayed so hard not to happen. At that moment, the system sent another message saying that the young man weighed 100 kilograms and 2 grams. Standing in place, the guy began to lament that he was 2 grams short of completing the quest he had started, which was extremely upsetting. The young man was angry and shouted because he had no idea how to solve this problem, although he knew for sure that it had to be solved. But a minute later, the system displayed a new message stating that our hero's weight was 100.0005 kilograms. Lee Saemin had a new idea. Just get rid of the water. The result was immediate. The computer wrote a notification that the participant would receive 100 points in the Transcendental Network as a reward. The computer suggested that the young man exchange his points for a level upgrade, which he happily agreed to. A minute later, the system sent a huge number of hints that could help him move forward. Our hero was so confused that he had no idea what to pay attention to. There was also good news. In honor of his first visit to the forum, the young man was given the opportunity to read one post for free. It was an article dedicated to Lee Se-min, written by the best demon hunter of all time. The young man realized that he should read it, so he clicked on the corresponding button and waited for a response. The screen said that the internal art of perfecting human abilities begins with Dantian and ends with the heavenly circle of the whole body. However, those who are subject to asphyxia cannot complete the heavenly circle. The reason is that their internal energies cannot circulate properly and dissipate like smoke. It went on to say that if the young man mastered the correct techniques and returned to the cycle, he would be able to break out of this state. The greatest demon hunter of all time passed on to the young man the supreme divine art he had created himself. The young man followed all the instructions specified in the relevant document. Our hero suddenly thought about how he had always seen the aura as a tool for control and power. With tears in his eyes, he continued to reflect on the fact that the greatest demon hunter of all time treated the aura as something alive. That was the main answer. Folding his arms, the young man continued to ponder the fact that great mercy is very difficult. Sitting on a bench, Lee Se-min immersed himself in his own thoughts, realizing that he now had to think differently, and that this was the key to everything. Lifting his head, the young man told himself that he would be ready to repeat this decision hundreds of times. He knew that it could change him and make him completely different. Focusing on the energy, the young man spread it throughout his body, and it began to act more strongly with each passing minute. He understood that he had to concentrate and imagine the process as if he were threading a needle. The greatest demon hunter of all time said that the aura flows through the body like water, spreading everywhere, like roots. It was necessary to follow this not so much mentally, as to feel and believe that it was really true. The young man knew that he had to focus on the obstacles his aura was trying to pass through. After that, all obstacles had to be broken through with one powerful movement. With each passing moment, the young man concentrated more and more, realizing that this time he had to do something almost impossible. A few minutes later, our hero was staring intently at his hands, outlined in green energy. Jumping up from his seat, the joyful young man finally shouted about his victory. He had succeeded. He had achieved what he had been striving for. Overjoyed, the young man fell onto his back, but it didn't matter to him. Lying there and smiling, he remembered how difficult everything had been for him, but he continued to move forward anyway. Raising his hand, Lee Se-min said with confidence that he could become much stronger, and he knew it for sure. A few days later, the young man decided to enroll in a private academy for training raiders. He understood that the strongest people trained here, who subsequently gained even more confidence in their own abilities and were capable of various maneuvers. One of the students informed the teacher that someone had come to see him, and the young man's expression betrayed some confusion. Leaving the hall, the coach pondered what he had achieved, as he had not expected to meet anyone. Our hero turned to the master, Mr. Hwang Jong-hoon, saying that they hadn't seen each other in a long time and expressing his joy at the meeting. The coach cried out in surprise when he realized that it was Lee Se-min standing in front of him, who, although he had not become a raider, had still managed to change. Hugging the young man, he said that now he could call him his brother and offered him a drink, although Lee Se-min immediately pointed out that he had come for another reason. Raising his hand, our hero began to demonstrate his aura, showing that it had become completely different. Hwang Jong-hoon froze in place, not believing his eyes. It was something incredible. The young man looked at the coach and asked to see his aura again, but from a different angle. At that moment, the master turned to the guys who were supposed to continue their training, and he himself left briefly to attend to his business. A few minutes later, Hwang Jong-hoon invited the hero into the hall to check the changes in his aura. At first, the young man did not communicate much, but he was curious to know the results. Suddenly, the young man heard Ringer's voice, who suggested he take a look at the results. Looking at the number, Lee Se-min was literally stunned. He couldn't believe his eyes because the scoreboard showed 1034. At that moment, our hero heard his name and congratulations from the master, who said that his curse was finally behind him. Sitting down, Lee Se-min thought to himself that he had only been practicing the technique for a month, and the value of his aura had increased almost 15 times. When asked by the coach how this could have happened, the young man replied that he had followed several effective recommendations. Folding his arms across his chest, he remarked that this was indeed a great achievement, and now it was possible to understand who was capable of what. In the hall, he told the guys that he used to like to give up and wanted someone to teach him a lesson. Smiling, Hwang Jong-hoon said with confidence that the young man would be able to defeat whoever became his opponent. Our hero was scared but ready to accept the challenge, clenching his fists and doing everything he could. A few minutes later, the opponents were already standing in the ring, and spectators gathered on all sides to watch this performance. The red-haired athlete, watching what was happening, asked in surprise if he really had to challenge this newcomer to a duel, and inquired how much aura he had. Hearing that it was slightly above 1,000, she paused for a moment. The young man decided that the bet would be over 1,000 points, and thought that Hwang Jong-hoon had probably trained this man before. He understood that it would be rude to just start fighting, so he introduced himself as Yu Jinsi, and his opponent heard his name. Our hero knew that a hand-to-hand fight without weapons was coming, and he was going to give it his all. Reaching out his hand, he knew that the battle was about to begin, and he was ready. His opponent decided that he could destroy this guy with very little energy thanks to his aura. However, the fight did not start as Yu Jinsei had expected. His opponent had already intercepted his blows, realizing that he would not give up so easily. In a moment, the young man realized that the best tactic was to attack, and began to actively look for loopholes to implement his plan. A moment later, Lee Seiman struck the red-haired guy with force. It was clear that the young man felt confident. He wanted to show his coach that he was not weak, and not one to give up so easily. A moment later, Yu Jinsei asked his opponent how he was feeling and if he was injured. Then he complimented him, saying that the young man really had the basics down, and that was already good. But the young man's movements showed that he still wanted to teach a lesson and would act as he saw fit. While striking, the young man asked Lee Seiman when he would start to fight seriously, because his strikes still resembled childish and awkward movements. A minute later, our hero was lying at the other end of the ring, and it was clear that his opponent had done something powerful. The young man watched his opponent, realizing that he was not so simple, and that the fight would continue until the end. The next second, the young man pounced on his opponent, deciding that the moment had come to end the fight. Lee Seiman did not even think about giving up, and quickly jumped up from his place, attacking the red-haired guy. Everyone gathered watched as he deftly dealt with his experienced opponent, wondering where he had learned jujitsu techniques. After all, it is well known that raiders have no time to study martial arts. Fighting monsters, they see no point in learning wrestling and pain techniques. The fight continued, and Yu Jinsei kept wondering where the guy learned so much. The young man did not look weak and struck blows, realizing that he had to look strong and skilled. At one point, the raider began to swing his legs, but it was clear from his head that he was not even close to reaching our hero. The crowd immediately began to laugh, saying that his blows were only air and that he was powerless in this fight. Yu Jinsei was ashamed because he understood that he was the subject of ridicule, even though he was actually much stronger than everyone thought. In a moment, the young man realized that he had to prove to himself and everyone else that he was capable of the almost impossible. Anger and determination were evident in the young man's eyes, and he wanted to strike as hard and fast as possible. His opponent got as close as possible to Lee Seiman and even hit him. At that moment, our hero began to gather his mana, until it was clear whether he would counterattack or defend. In the next second, a blow was struck to his opponent's chin, and it was clearly not easy for him. Lee Seiman knew he couldn't stop and continued to act. A second later, Yu Jinsei was already lying on the floor, not understanding what had happened. Our hero left his foot in such a way that his opponent could not get up and strike back. The young man did not give up, and used several more powerful techniques. The red-haired guy angrily asked how he dared to do such a thing. Raising his hand, the young man gathered all his mana to fight back and show who was boss. His opponent was outraged that he could not be humiliated, but the newcomer broke the rules, shocking everyone. The coach saw that something was wrong, turned to his protege, and headed for the ring to stop the fight. A moment later, Hwang Jong-hoon began to separate the boys, realizing that the fight was over. A short time later, our hero was already running down the street. This became one of his favorite activities after he started training. The guy kept telling himself that he needed to be happy, pull himself together, and control his emotions. He understood that his opponent was untrained and acted incorrectly, and he simply lacked motivation. He did not understand why all this was necessary. Lee Seiman's victory in sparring was the result of his diligent daily training, which even his coach noted. The young man reflected on the fact that the strength had always been within him. It had simply been accumulating, so it was not surprising that he was able to defeat his opponent. When they entered the gym where our hero was training, several guys looked at him closely and noted that the strongman had been able to change in just 3 months, which seemed incredible. However, the young man knew that all 3 months of training had been exhausting, and he had to work hard to achieve his goals. While training, the young man felt the heat, but it did not bother him. Lee Seiman was proud of himself and showed off in front of the guys, who watched him with surprise. A moment later, the stranger addressed our hero as an equal, since they were practically the same age. After a brief pause, one of the guys asked the young man if it really took him only 3 months to change so dramatically. He added, if someone else managed to do it, then he himself could become like our hero. Addressing these guys, the young man boldly said that they had come to the wrong person, although they did not yet understand the essence of the matter. At that moment, a thunderous voice demanded that they show respect to their mentor. Kim Dok-bae looked closely at the young people, greeted them, and said he was glad to see them. The man introduced himself and explained that he was a coach. A minute later, he suggested that the guys discuss everything in his office. Lee Seiman saw the door close and heard the newcomers waiting in horror for what was to come. After a while, the coach came out with the guys, saying that they wanted to become like our hero and achieve better results. He explained that they should follow the same training program that the young man had been following for 3 months. The coach explained that a contract had been signed requiring the guys to attend the gym at certain times, which was a big plus for everyone. Smiling, Lee Seiman wished them luck and noted that it would be interesting, though not entirely easy. After finishing his training, the young man went to the website to check for new posts. Standing in the middle of the gym, he thought about how long ago he had started visiting this website. At that moment, the newcomers were watching the coach intently, finding what was happening incredible. Suddenly, one of the guys said that it was his first day of training, and he felt like he was about to fall. At that moment, the young people watched one of the trainees, who looked strange. The guys noticed that an aura was forming around him. but they didn't understand what he was doing with it. They decided that he was most likely a rider, as only they possess such unique abilities. At that moment, the young man called the stranger his senior comrade, although the stranger did not understand what he was talking about. He just stood there, watching and trying to memorize all the movements of what was happening. Standing in the gym, Lee Seaman thought about how people had been looking at him strangely lately. This was especially true of the newcomers who had recently joined the gym. The guy felt uncomfortable because of all the attention, but there was nothing he could do about it. Looking at the guys, he thought to himself that he didn't know what plans these newcomers were hatching. At that moment, one of them approached Lee Seaman and spoke to him politely. The young man said that he felt something unusual while watching Lee Seaman, which discouraged him as much as possible. He began to talk about who our hero was, although he himself did not fully understand the meaning of what was happening. Lee Seaman couldn't understand anything, as the newcomer spoke incoherently and inconsistently. A moment later, the newcomer came even closer and stated that Lee Seaman was a raider. The young man decided to play along, thinking that there was no need to be afraid, and that everything was not as scary as it might seem. It turned out that he was not yet a full-fledged raider, but was going to take the exam in a month. The bespectacled individual expressed envy toward those who would take the exam, as he himself aspired to become a raider. The young man looked at him in surprise, believing what he said. A moment later, the young man began to disperse his mana, explaining that he was also a raider, but had not yet developed his abilities. Lee Seaman didn't understand why the newcomer wasn't going to the Raider Academy, but he explained that his parents considered this profession dangerous, so he was waiting until he came of age. The young man decided to focus on his studies and strengthen his physical strength at the same time. At that moment, he thought that many raiders reveal their abilities late, and that it takes both time and effort to become a true professional. The young man reiterated that he was destined to become a raider. Lee Seaman did not understand such zeal, but the bespectacled man continued to confidently note his determination. Raider is one of the most prestigious professions, ranking high in surveys of schoolchildren's career aspirations. When our hero asked if the bespectacled young man knew how to control his aura, he replied that he knew only a little. After a while, the bespectacled man was asked to demonstrate this skill. Despite his fear and uncertainty, he pulled himself together, sat down on a bench, and began to concentrate his aura. Lee Seaman noticed that the bespectacled individual was performing well and complimented him, noting that he should not stop there, but rather continue to progress. Our hero explained that the main thing was to control the aura, and that this skill should be improved every day. As he left, the bespectacled man called the young man a smart kid, and added that someday they would reach the top together. It was nice to hear because support shows that someone really believes in him. Lee Seaman saw how inspired the newcomer was, and realized that he had said everything he thought. A moment later, the bespectacled man approached his friend, showing everyone with his whole demeanor that he would continue to train and develop. Our hero, in turn, thought about how great it felt to instill hope and faith in someone. However, clutching his head with both hands, he realized that he had been working too hard, and could use a little rest and refreshment. After getting out of the shower, the young man talked about some authoritative person. Although it was not entirely clear what he was talking about, he continued to say that it was actually great, and therefore the best demon hunter should wait a little while to gather strength. The guy also knew that the computer board was very helpful in learning new skills, and it was really useful. He told the others that he was online today, as usual. He added that after that, he was going to do a little research to get his raider qualification. So he decided to check if it was true that the advanced part of the test would be random this time. However, everyone knew that the tasks were different every year, and no one knew exactly what to expect. They could only make separate assumptions. Even after successfully passing the written tests, aura assessment, and combat skills, it was often only possible to obtain a certificate after an in-depth test. Last year, it was a debate. Sitting in front of the computer, our hero wondered why raiders needed this additional knowledge at all, since it seemed completely unnecessary. Lee Seaman thought that a good raider only needed to fight and kill monsters, and that he didn't need anything else. Leaning back in his chair, he said aloud, "Are there really people who spend money on this?" The young man thought about it, realizing that making such a decision was not easy for him. Soon, he called to find out how much the fee was and whether it was possible to attend in person, after which he asked for the account number to be sent to him. After hanging up, Lee Seaman thought about it, deciding that this was enough, even though he didn't fully understand what it was all about. After that, the young man decided that very soon the whole world would know about him and hear his name. The next day, our hero, as he had done for the past few months, went out to the playground to exercise in the fresh air. Despite the fact that the coach was in control of everything in the gym, the young man did everything he could. He paused for a moment, sensing a strange smell, not understanding where it was coming from. He turned his head and noticed a girl running along the field. The beauty immediately sensed that he was looking at her and froze for a moment, trying to catch someone's gaze. Looking at our hero, she noticed that they already knew each other, although the guy was trying his best not to show it. The girl continued to wonder how the young man had lost so much weight that she barely recognized him. But Lee Seaman noticed that this did not prevent him from exercising. It turned out that the beauty was in no hurry. Moreover, she apologized for being so rude last time. A moment later, she introduced herself and said her name was Kim Seon-ha. Our hero did not want to be rude, so he calmly gave his name. When his new acquaintance asked if he was a raider, the guy honestly admitted that he was planning to take the exams in the near future. The beauty smiled, wished him luck, and said that she was also going to take the exam to join their company. It seemed that something had changed in the guy, because he said quite kindly that he would look forward to meeting her. After that, Lee Se-min asked his new acquaintance if she wanted to bet with him. Although the beauty did not quite understand what he was talking about, the young man explained that he was referring to himself and the newcomer Kim Sung-ha had mentioned, and noted that it would be interesting to see which of the two would win. The guy confirmed everything he had said earlier, although it seemed that Kim Sung-ha did not fully understand what he was talking about. However, after a moment, the girl thought about this argument and asked if there really would be no refusals. The beauty was angry and thought to herself that not long ago this man had been an ordinary weakling, and now he was pretending to be someone he wasn't. Just a few weeks later, our hero walked confidently to the center to take his exams. Looking around, the young man mentally appealed to the transcendents from the city, asking them to believe in him. Suddenly, in the crowd, Lee Se-min accidentally spotted the guy he had sparred with about a month ago. However, this did not scare or anger our hero in the least. He simply said aloud to himself that he could not fail this exam after everything that had happened to him. The guy kept thinking that this time everything would be completely different, that he would definitely succeed. The exam began with a written test, and at that moment, our hero realized that the test had become a little more difficult this year. Reading everything that was written, Lee Se-min realized that it really did look difficult, and that there were many tricks in the questions. However, at the same time, he understood that hard work always pays off and brings even greater rewards. Therefore, while studying, the young man gave his all to emerge victorious. As he worked hard, the young man realized that he had no chance of an easy path and that only continuous victory awaited him. Although at that moment it seemed that the other participants were having a much harder time than he was, they did not show it. It was interesting to see if the first part was so difficult. What would be in the advanced test? After a while, the instructor told everyone to look at their watches and added that it was time to finish, so they should put down their pens and raise their hands. The man warned that from that moment on, anyone who moved would be immediately disqualified. Our hero completed the task, while the young people who did not listen to the lecturer and continued to write something attracted attention. The teacher did not wait and instantly immobilize these people temporarily. The lecturer reiterated that he had warned everyone and added that he did not like being disobeyed, so he did what had to do. Pointing to the students, the man said that they were disqualified and had to leave the exam immediately. He continued that for raiders who put their lives on the line, discipline is paramount. Any slight mistake puts the whole team at risk, and the rules are there to be followed. He added that no one likes raiders who don't play by the rules. Then in a gentle tone wished everyone luck and said they were doing well. The young people gathered here discussed the exam and the possibility of failure. But it was no less important to them to know where their aura stood. Our hero, in turn, decided that the test was difficult, but he did not think he had failed, because he had prepared a lot and studied the material. He knew that to get certified, his aura level had to be at least 5,000, and last time he took the test, he had 5,100. While Lee Se-min skillfully controlled his aura, the unwitting witnesses watched him intently, as if they had never seen anything like it before. However, none of that mattered to the young man. He knew that he had to try to clear his mind and relax so that everything would go well. The young man imagined it over and over again, repeating to himself that he would definitely succeed, because it couldn't be any other way. Still, the frightening visions related to the exam prevented him from completely relaxing and focusing on what lay ahead. At that moment, the young man remembered his mentor and decided to follow his advice. The highest symbols represent the harmony of all things and phenomena in the universe, yang heaven and earth, as well as primordial accessibility, gentleness, and righteousness. Controlling the aura is associated with many different memories, sometimes not the most pleasant ones. Recalling the first time Lee Se-min talked about his desire to become a raider, he thought to himself, at that moment, his parents believed in him, and it seemed to him that it was all worth it. The young man was deeply moved because he understood how important it is to have someone believe in you your whole life. But the young man was unable to finish his studies and reflections because the lecturer suddenly approached him and asked what he was doing. After that, the lecturer noted that aura control must be practiced in a safe place, which is the basis of the basics, seeing how the hero apologizes. Our hero said he knew that, but sometimes he simply had no choice. The man supported him, explaining that he had once practiced this in a forest teeming with monsters. This sparked interest, and the teacher explained that this was the fate of raiders, that any battle was dangerous, and that mana management was sometimes extremely necessary. Adjusting his glasses, the man looked intently at the young man, but he was not angry at all. Moreover, he recounted how once, through the gate, they encountered a huge number of all kinds of creatures, among which was an unidentified one called the Black Castle. During their first encounter with this monster, the raider was unable to obtain enough information to identify it, and since then, no one has encountered it again. At that moment, one of the students entered the room and said that the second part of the exam would begin very soon, and that they needed to prepare. The man, addressing Lee Se-min, thanked him for the warning, and added that he would conduct the second part of the exam himself. Turning to the young man, the lecturer explained that it was time to go to the second floor, where all the other participants had already gathered. With a smile, he sincerely wished the young man excellent results. The young man enjoyed talking to this person, so he sincerely thanked him for everything. After a while, upon arriving at the right room, the young man said that he wanted to measure the value of his aura, and was told that he would have to wait a little. Lee Se-min stood in line, realizing that he just needed to sit down and have his aura checked. There was nothing scary about it, although he was very nervous. A few seconds later, a strange sound came from the room, and all the test subjects began to wonder what was happening. The stranger came out of the room and shared his impressions, although the crowd was still discussing what was happening. Suddenly, the young man announced who had measured his aura and paused for a moment. A moment later, he continued and explained that the girl's score was 30,000, which was the most amazing thing he had ever seen. Hearing such numbers, our hero's eyes widened. He had never seen anything like it and never even thought it was possible. The young people began to discuss this news, because they had never heard of anything like this before and did not think that anyone could develop their abilities to such an extent. Suddenly, one of the test subjects approached Lee Seaman and quietly said that everyone was saying that a girl named Pan Yubi could do incredible things. Hearing this, the guy was simply stunned. The reason was not how high her scores were, but who she was. The young man knew her. Moreover, she had found him herself a few months ago to get acquainted, and today it turned out that she was the strongest among the strongest. Responding to our hero's question about whether people who pass this test will be able to meet her, he said no, and most likely nothing like that will happen, since all the guys are strong. Despite this, Lee Seaman was quite worried. He knew that the last time his aura was measured, it was at 5,100, and he hoped that it would at least rise a little. The line moved fairly quickly, and after a few minutes, the researchers turned to our hero and told him to go into the hall. The frightened young man knew what he had to do, but despite this, he was nervous, as if he had come to this place for the first time. Lying in the chamber, the young man heard the person who was to conduct the tests tell him not to be nervous as the procedure began. The guy squeezed his eyes shut as tightly as he could. In fact, he was extremely nervous, although he tried not to show it. A moment later, the stranger addressed the test subject by name. After that, he happily announced that Lee Seaman's Owly score was 7,180. As the young man stood up, the stranger said that all the tests were complete and that the student could leave. Finally, the young man could express his emotions. He was delighted that in just 1 month he had managed to make such progress, and it was a real victory for him. However, instead of going about his business, the young man began to rejoice so much that he literally crawled on the floor, calling everyone brothers and sisters. A few minutes later, Lee Seaman began to cry, expressing his hope that the people who worked in this place would have great luck in the future. Our hero's joy knew no bounds. He repeatedly noted that he had managed to do something completely incredible, which he had always strived for. At that moment, the guy received a message. The stranger wrote that he was offering to go out for a bite to eat together. The city was as crowded as ever, even though the sun was already setting on the horizon. Sitting in one of the establishments, Lee Seaman stared intently at something, completely immersed in his own world, and it was true. Biting his cocktail stick, the young man reflected on the fact that this world was not really just one, but full of possibilities. But he didn't have time to finish his thought, because a girl he knew well appeared in front of him. The guy said aloud that she felt extremely confident not only in company, but also in life in general, because she had such a strong trump card up her sleeve. It turned out that the beauty had no equal. She really felt like a person who knew her worth in this world. The young man thought about it and felt a little jealous of this beauty. He wanted to become strong enough to compete with her one day. However, at that moment he did not hear someone touch his back, and instead of joy, he cried out in fear. It was the same group of people who had joined the gym about a month ago, and now wanted to know how their friends' exams had gone. Smiling, the young man noted that everything had gone wonderfully. He wanted to celebrate the occasion and asked his friends what they wanted to eat. A little time passed, and soon everyone had delicious pork with lots of different spices on the table. Lee Seaman said that today he realized how important it is to live life to the fullest, and therefore he intends to take action. At the same time, he asked the guys not to be shy and to eat. The bespectacled man, seeing the young man frying meat, asked why he didn't become, for example, the manager of a meat restaurant, where he could combine business with pleasure. He immediately added that if such an ignorant person took over a meat restaurant, one could imagine what a real disgrace it would be for the nation. After that, the guys started laughing, noting that in reality, each of them had their own path, so if they didn't stick to it, they could run into trouble. At that very moment, the door opened and our heroes saw a group of young people, among whom was the girl with the high aura readings. The young people said that there were 5 adults, so they would like to choose a spacious table. Coming closer and looking at Lee Seaman, Raider told the young man that they had met again. Turning to her friend Kim Song-ha, she noted that the guy standing in front of her was the same one who claimed he could defeat her with his eyes closed. While the brunette was introducing herself, our hero realized that there had been a slight misunderstanding. It turned out that the high scores were not hers, but those of the newcomer she had come to support. The beauty wished the young man bon appétit and added that he should not forget about their bet. With anger in his voice, the young man wanted to take back his words and declared aloud that he had never said anything like that. As they were saying goodbye on the street, our hero's new friends asked who the girls were, who looked quite cute and pleasant, hinting that they would like to get to know them. Lee Se-min proudly declared that you should never judge a book by its cover. Pouncing on the guys, he continued to note that girls should be chosen carefully, adding that now it would be best for all 3 of them to go to a karaoke bar. However, as soon as the guys started walking, they heard a strange, subtle hissing and movement behind them. Lee Se-min found this extremely strange, so he paused for a moment to turn around. The guy didn't understand what was going on. He saw strange lights, more like lightning bolts that existed on their own. Our hero's friends immediately began to wonder what was going on, as they had never noticed anything like this before. At that moment, it seemed that everything became clear to the young man, so he turned to Ying-jae and Ji-min. Pushing his friends forward, the young man shouted that they should leave this place as soon as possible. Our hero thought to himself that he had a bad feeling, even though he had not yet seen the whole picture of what was happening. Literally a second later, a bright stream of light appeared from the ground, which was not only light, but also one of the most powerful energies. Grabbing his friends, Lee Se-min said in a frightened tone that it was a gate. He immediately began shouting to everyone present that a gate had opened at this location, indicating a high level of risk and danger. At that moment, all passers-by noticed the cracked ground, from which powerful streams of energy were emanating from different directions. The guys had read about something like this, but they couldn't believe that they would soon encounter it on a normal, unremarkable evening. A huge monster burst out of the ground, raging and growling, demonstrating all its power. Our hero thought to himself that this was Sinkus, whom he had heard and read about many times. His mere appearance caused passers-by, including our heroes, to be literally knocked to the ground by a powerful surge of energy. However, the young man was not surprised by this. He focused on his body and looked intently ahead. The guy did not understand why he could not move, while his acquaintance shouted for everyone to leave the street immediately. The girl turned to her assistant and asked her for help, realizing that extra people in such a situation would only get in the way. Everyone knew that the association represented was not one of the big three, but it was still an elite raider company. A moment later, something strange began to happen. It turned out that the guys were not going to call anyone, but wanted to eliminate this monster as soon as possible. The fearless Kim Sun-ha immediately grabbed one of her weapons and headed towards the monster. The beauty began to swing her sword, hoping to inflict at least some damage on the monster before help arrived, in case they couldn't handle it on their own. But a minute later, something went wrong. The frightened girl looked intently in front of her, clearly not understanding what had happened. Another monster named Yorg appeared right in front of the beauty, which meant that instead of one monster, she now had to fight two. Kim Sun-ha stood among these monsters and seemed to have no idea how to act in such a situation in order to both inflict damage and remain safe. The beauty immediately shouted to someone to immediately block the threat or protect someone. One of the monsters attacked the person standing closest to it. Our hero heard how desperately this stranger begged for help, but Lee Se-min was so confused that he had no idea what he could do. Despite this, clenching his fists, the guy kept telling himself to go and help, because he hadn't trained hard for several months for nothing. Watching the monsters stare at his friend, Lee Se-min commanded his body to obey, and it gradually began to move. In-jae clearly had no intention of giving up, so he swung his arm to strike his powerful opponent. It really worked. Within a minute, one of the monsters was lying on the floor. Despite this, the young man was not going to give up. Holding his stick, he looked intently at the second beast, preparing to fight back. Watching all this, our hero reflected on the fact that his friend, who had never been properly trained, was able to do something like this. The young man fought as bravely as possible, as if he had seen these monsters more than once. In fact, those who did not know that In-jae was an ordinary student might think that he was a raider who had been doing this for several years. At that moment, Lee Se-min thought that his acquaintance would surely become one of the most incredible monster hunters. However, a minute later, something happened that the young man did not expect. The monster clamped down on In-jae's shoulder, and the next bite could be fatal. Realizing that any delay could cost him his life, our hero rushed to his friend. At that moment, the young man was already lying on the ground, and the predator was staring intently at him, clearly not intending to stop. Despite his proximity and speed, Lee Se-min seemed unable to get close to his opponent. Suddenly, he found a spear somewhere and prepared to throw it at the bloodthirsty monster. The result was immediate, and the predator was defeated. Our hero heard one of the raiders ask if the young man was all right, and In-jae replied that he was fine, but there was an injured person on the ground who needed help. Lifting his friend up, Lee Se-min immediately began to take care of him, realizing that the young man had done something incredible. Another raider approached them and asked In-jae if he was really awakened, since he fought like a real beast. The young man was weakened and did not want to talk or explain anything. He was just waiting for help. At that moment, Lee Se-min thought that he had used the power of his aura to stop the enemy and help his friend, and that was the end of his thoughts. Our heroes were so absorbed in their own thoughts that they forgot that danger was still nearby. At that moment, the red-haired beauty cried out, quickly asking all the raiders to come to her. Thanks to the powerful flow of energy emitted by all the raiders, they managed to defeat the monsters. Turning to her colleague, the beauty said that for such a large monster, it was quite agile, and that was a big problem for all of them. She immediately added that she knew a way to destroy the monster, but she couldn't reach its head, although the girl already understood that help had arrived. The most important thing was to drive the monster into a trap and strike it from the other side at the same time. It was clear that this wasn't the first time the girl had faced something like this, so she felt as confident as possible and understood her task clearly. Kim Sun-ha jumped onto the building at lightning speed to get to the right spot and achieve the desired result. In a moment, the beauty was flying, concentrating a powerful stream of mana in her hand, and not forgetting to take her weapon with her. It was incredible, a true raider from God, who perfectly coped with her task and could deal with almost any threat. Aiming her weapon at the enemy, the beauty shouted that she was avenging everyone whom this monster had threatened. Kim Sun-ha felt extremely confident. It was clear that she had faced similar situations hundreds of times before, and knew how to choose the right approach. In just a minute, the monster was already lying on the ground, which meant that the raider had managed to accomplish the task. That's why the girl smiled and said that it was a really difficult task, but they managed to defeat such a powerful enemy. After that, she said that it seemed like the gates would close soon, and there wasn't much time left. However, our heroes watched closely because they thought they saw something that others did not notice. Indeed, in the middle, there were monsters resembling monkeys, but very large and with huge fangs. Lee Se-min couldn't take his eyes off them. He just watched the creatures closely, trying to understand what would happen next. It seemed that the gate was getting smaller and smaller, but the monster was not going to reveal itself. However, the young man knew for sure that the monster was watching him, although the reasons for this remained unknown. At that moment, Ying-je felt something incredibly immense and strange. However, he soon realized what had happened to the young man who had been attacked by the monster. Our hero was happy to note that he was fine, thanks to the young man who was not afraid to fight the monster. Smiling, the guy said that even though he wasn't a full-fledged raider, it was the least they could do in such a situation. Seeing that the ambulance had already arrived, Lee Se-min confirmed that everything had gone well, and that they had done a lot of good. The next day, while on the set, the guy reflected on how the battle site had begun to be restored, and life had returned to normal. However, the battle with the monsters turned out to be different from what he had imagined. If it weren't for the profession and skills of the raiders who happened to be nearby, our hero could have died, and that was the harsh truth. The young man kept thinking about what had happened, recalling the terrifying images that were impossible to forget. It was at that moment that he understood and realized that this was not a game, but a very serious and dangerous situation. At that moment, the coach approached and said that it was too late and he should go home. Wiping the sweat from his brow, the young man noted to himself that they had told him the truth. It was indeed too late. Kim Dok-bae knew that something important had happened, and calmly offered the young man some chamomile tea to calm him down. Sitting at the table, the man sincerely expressed his regret that In-jae had been hurt, and that the events had happened at the wrong time and in the wrong place. Hearing this, the young man began to talk about the awakened masters, and Kim Dok-bae showed that he knew a lot about such events, and that he knew that the young man was currently taking exams. Lowering his gaze slightly, the young man admitted that when he first encountered the monsters, his whole body went numb, and it was extremely strange and incomprehensible. The coach looked at him intently but did not rush to respond. It was difficult to find the right words. Putting the cup on the table, he honestly admitted that while he was worrying about himself, his best friend had suffered. With sadness in his voice, the young man asked if he would be able to become a good raider in the future, since he had already shown weakness at the initial stage. Kim Dok-bae watched the young man, seeing how he was struggling with himself, but again did not rush to say anything. Finally, the master revealed that before opening the gym, he himself had been an actor, which many found hard to believe. The young man was interested to hear this, and noted that the coach was probably the first to knock out his opponents with a single blow. Laughing, the man admitted that he had indeed been lost in his own thoughts. After a short pause, he recounted the events that had happened to one young man at that time. This person had suffered a misfortune and died right in the middle of a fight. The coach was so affected by this that he decided never to enter the ring again, because he simply couldn't do it. After that, the man asked Lee Se-min why he had told him his short, sad story. Then he added that it was time to stop feeling sorry for himself and dwelling on the past. Pouring another drink, the mentor continued, saying that what was done, and the young man should not lock himself in his room, crying about the mistakes of the past for the rest of his life. All people make mistakes. Of course, one can regret, for example, if a vital blow was accidentally dealt to an opponent, and the opponent did not stop in time. The point is that sooner or later, everyone experiences fear. But despite this, they should not dwell on the past. They must move forward to find something truly valuable. After these words, the men clinked glasses as a sign that they were leaving the unpleasant past behind. Kim Dok-bae asked the young man again who would win if he from the past and he from the present met. The young man replied that the man from the past would most likely win. The mentor laughed and explained that this was not the case, as he was much weaker in the past. There was no point in waving his fists now, and the mentor fell silent. Then he said that the young man had become stronger both physically and mentally, which meant he had every chance of becoming a real raider. The young man was pleased to hear this, and to believe in himself even more, he took a small sip of rum. Putting the glass on the table, Lee Se-min thought for a moment before speaking. Then, with determination in his voice, he declared that his mentor was absolutely right. The next day, he went to the Taesong Academy, where he was going to fight one of his teachers on the field. The young man stood with his eyes closed, but in his hands he held a weapon with which he was going to strike. The young man did not just hold his sword, he concentrated mana in his hands so that the blow would be as strong and focused as possible. A moment later, a hologram of one of the predators appeared in the hall, which the novice had to fight, as this was how novices could hone their skills. The beast growled, and it was clear that it was about to pounce on the young man who was waiting for this moment. The monster did not so much pounce on the raider, as sink its teeth into his weapon, wanting to deprive the young man of his main weapon. However, the enemy failed, as the young man skillfully threw it into the opposite corner of the hall. Lee Se-min, standing blindfolded, could only rely on his own intuition. At that moment, the young man began to think that this monster was weak, and then scolded himself for not being able to defeat it last time. Suddenly, the instructor shouted, saying that the most important thing was not to give in to anger, and not to let emotions take over everything else. Lee Se-min replied to his mentor that he understood and wanted to continue the training. The young man asked to turn on the hologram of Sinkus. the very monster he had failed to defeat on the street. Only a few seconds passed, and the young man's request was fulfilled. Before him stood a formidable opponent. The young man felt the predator with his whole body and was ready to fight, despite his fear. In an instant, the young man swung with force to strike his opponent and end it as quickly as possible. However, the blows did not reach their target as desired in this virtual world. A little time passed, and the young man felt something powerful rising above him, although he did not understand what it was. Straightening up and gripping his sword even tighter, Lee Seaman began to twist the energy flows again, hoping that this time it would work. The beast watched the young man closely and growled, showing that it was not going to give up even in front of a hologram. Suddenly, the monster withdrew its paw and placed it right next to the young man, who miraculously managed to jump out of the way. Holding the weapon in front of him, Lee Seaman repeated to himself that the most important thing was to unite his body and mind. At that moment, he realized that with his newfound power, he could defeat the monster without any problems. While the young man was thinking this, energy crashed down on the spot where he was standing. The monster was not real, but it imitated everything that could happen in the real world, so such moments could not be ignored. But the young man was not angry. He understood that the more he honed this style of martial arts, the better he understood his own thinking. The young man knew that in this battle, he couldn't relax. He had to concentrate completely in order to do everything right. His perception took him back to the day when the gate was opened. It seemed that the young man wanted to immerse himself in the spirit of that event in order to decide something for himself, or prove something to himself. Of course, he was only facing a hologram of a monster, but all his thoughts were in his head and directly related to how to fight the battle correctly. The predator screamed as loud as it could, simultaneously releasing a powerful stream of energy. Only a few days passed, and the moment of the second stage of the exam, which took place in the Colosseum, arrived. The hall was crowded, and the tension was palpable, as all the examinees were awaiting real battles. Each student was assigned a weapon that they would use to show themselves in the best light during the exam. Lee Seaman immediately thought to himself that although he was in a training center, the props looked very shabby and worn out. The other guys were discussing who would be participating in the event today, and who had a platinum mark. At that moment, a young man appeared before the gathering, congratulated everyone who had passed the first stage of the exam, and talked about the preparation. The armor worn by the examinees was equipped with sensors that recorded fatal hits, and the opponent was defeated. After that, the students' movements will be restricted, and the main task is to neutralize as many opponents as possible. The prize will go to the last one remaining on the field. After signing the documents, all the students headed to the exam venue. While the students were digesting the information, the lecturer wished them all the best and said he would see them a little later. The young people were in no hurry to leave, waiting for further instructions or explanations. After a while, everyone gathered outside on a large square. The lecturer's voice announced that there were 5 minutes left before the exam began. Now the students were wondering whether they should choose their own seats or stay where they were standing. Suddenly, one of the lecturers appeared in front of them and warned that the exam would begin soon. At that moment, a stranger approached Lee Seaman and suggested that he take a slightly more distant position. The young man paused and admitted that he had chosen to observe from the sidelines. However, the red-haired guy didn't like that, and he watched Lee Seaman closely. The young man was annoyed that someone had chosen their own tactics, and he decided to deliver decisive blows to show his strength and intelligence. In the process, he happily declared that he was in no hurry and had plenty of time. It was clear that the sparring would be intense, and none of the participants were going to give in. As he struck his red-haired opponent, he shouted that now was the time to get to know each other better. However, Lee Seaman had completely different thoughts, and did not understand why he should waste his energy and time on this. At that moment, the young man let go of his weapon, but it was part of his deliberate plan. And it worked. A moment later, he was already striking his opponent with his bare hand. The guy was determined, although he didn't understand why he was taking such a risk by giving up his weapon. The judges watching the action turned to our hero's opponent, number 222, and announced his defeat. Lying on the ground, the young man couldn't understand why he had chosen such an unusual tactic, but nothing could be changed now. Lifting the visor of his cap, Lee Seaman listened carefully to what the judges were saying, and learned that number 13 was receiving extra points. The young man realized that he had to move on, turned around, picked up his sword, and headed towards his opponent. Several judges gathered in the monitoring room, watching what was happening on the screen and discussing what they saw. At that moment, they noticed number 222 and wondered why he had been knocked out of the fight so quickly. He wondered to himself who this remarkable strongman was, who had achieved the seemingly impossible. Another judge said aloud that there were rumors that the Iron Horse Association had a talented newcomer. Another man added that he had also heard about a girl whose aura already exceeded 30,000. Kim Sun-ha immediately joined the conversation and noted that their new awakened member was trying very hard. The beauty thought to herself that all the judges were quite calm, and everyone present inspired confidence. Meanwhile, the contestants on the field heard the judges call out one by one those who had failed the test and were automatically eliminated. At the same time, number 172 received extra points for defeating 3 opponents. Our hero remembered the phrase of the greatest monster hunter of all time. Fighting with the use of aura is like submission. It is indeed a powerful process, comparable to almost nothing else, as it involves energy. Therefore, the aura had to be activated at all times. But the point was not only in the aura itself, but also in the ability to combine it with martial arts. Fighting monsters is very different from hunting animals with weapons. In battle with monsters, Raider risks not only his life, but also his universe. Everyone knows that this is Raider's real battle, which they have heard so much about, but they can only experience it during real combat. Of course, what was happening on the field was just an imitation, but it gave an idea of what awaited hunters in the dungeons. While the judges were announcing the eliminated players, our hero ran deep into the forest. The people in the conference room watched closely and discussed how Lee Seaman was proving himself to be quite fast and agile. They did not know who the young man really was, but some added that he was indeed strong, as he had beaten many rivals who had been heavily favored. At that moment, the red-haired beauty took a closer look and realized who he was, and was so surprised that she even opened her mouth. The young people asked her if she knew the young man who was so skillfully completing all the tasks. The beauty admitted that she was partially acquainted with him, but did not go into details. Time passed. For some, it flew by quickly. For others, it seemed like an eternity, as the battles continued. The brunette, on whom bets were being placed, did everything she could to outmaneuver her opponents and become stronger. It seemed as if she never tired and didn't care what stood in her way. The beauty knew what she wanted and tried not to pay attention to the other contestants. At that moment, the judges announced again that one of the guys had been defeated, which meant that with each passing minute, fewer and fewer students remained on the field. Hearing this, the brunette rejoiced, wondering who her next opponent would be, wanting to finish the fight as quickly as possible. However, her attention was drawn to an unusual noise coming from all sides. Suddenly, Lee Seaman appeared in front of her. He watched the brunette intently, neither speaking nor starting the fight. The girl spoke first, clearly recognizing the guy, although she did not mention his name. She remembered that this young man had been on the street when the portal opened, but he hadn't joined the fight, just stood there watching. She knew that all the guys were trying to show something, but apart from that, the young man did absolutely nothing, and most interestingly, he didn't even try. Embarrassed, the beauty could think of nothing else to say but that they hadn't seen each other in a long time. After that, she mentioned that she had heard rumors that he and Kim Sung-ha had argued before the exam began. Despite this, the brunette thought to herself that her future rival used to be a very ordinary guy, and it was hard to believe that he could easily defeat his opponents. The girl thought to herself that someone with good skills would be afraid of a monster. Could that really be true? Out loud, she suggested not wasting time and starting the battle already. The beauty swung her sword, believing in her own strength. But she was confused by this young man, and did not fully believe that he was capable of anything serious. Soon, the young people began their sparring, although it seemed like the most unusual situation possible. Lee Seaman watched his opponent and thought to himself that the brunette had started so quickly that he hadn't even had time to understand anything, let alone think about anything. The girl's aura was truly overwhelming, and there was no denying it. It radiated genuine strength and power. The young man knew it would not be easy, but he was not going to give up, as he had trained to achieve his ultimate goal. The brunette herself did not know what to expect, and simply fought face to face, just as she had done until now. Unexpectedly, the beauty managed to find our hero's weak spot, and struck him with all her might in the solar plexus. It was unpleasant, and forced the young man to sit down for a while, giving himself and his opponent a chance to rest a little. The beauty thought about how her opponent was clearly weaker than her, but despite this, he continued to stick to his tactics, and showed no signs of giving up. The brunette realized that the young man still had a clear advantage in skill, even though he was still slightly weaker than her. Therefore, she wasted no time and carefully analyzed her opponent's weaknesses, planning to adjust her further tactics. Raising her hand, the student decided that this could not go on any longer, and that something urgently needed to be changed. The reason was that the thought of someone being better than her filled her with anger. She had always believed that this could not be the case. At that moment, the beauty made a powerful move, deciding that she craved victory and would not give up the fight for anything. Lee Seaman had never seen anything like it, and for a moment it seemed to him that his opponent had turned into a monster. Perhaps it was an illusion. He knew that the sword that conquered demons had hidden power, and the character on the blade signified something mysterious. A demon was hidden inside the sword that could be awakened. The sword completely subjugates its owner, and the skill's possessor can display a thirst for blood similar to that of a real monster. Indeed, at that moment, the brunette looked as determined and vicious as possible, giving the impression that she would stop at nothing and no one. Lee Seaman felt his opponent's incredible aura, and did not understand how she managed to show such a thirst for blood. Everything he saw looked frightening. Despite this, the young man was sure that on that day, the girl saw his fear of the monster, which is why she chose such a tactic. Our hero stood still and thought about his actions, realizing that the main thing was not to rush, because in such moments it was easy to make mistakes. The guy remembered his training well, and was not going to give up just because his opponent knew a little more than he did. Grabbing his sword, the young man's eyes showed determination, not only to fight, but to win. The brunette noticed this and said that the young man had changed since their last meeting. The young man had no intention of giving up, and proudly declared that he was not one of those guys who were easily defeated. Moreover, Lee Seaman noted that he had nowhere to run from this place, but he did not want to run anywhere, wanting to face his fear head-on. The opponents froze. None of them seemed to be going to strike first. They just looked at each other intently. Time passed, and the young people stood facing each other. After a moment, the brunette decided that it was time to start, as she wanted to end it all as soon as possible and emerge as the sole victor. Our hero was constantly thinking about this himself. He was not going to back down and was already ready to take the blow. However, before the guys had a chance to show their full potential, the judges loudly announced that the test was over. Continuing to stand opposite each other, the opposing sides could not understand why the test had ended so unexpectedly. Falling to the ground, the guys heard again that the second stage of the exam was over, and that all those injured should follow the instructions and seek medical attention. Our hero lay there and stared intently at the sky, not understanding what had happened to him. Smiling, he said aloud that he was glad to be alive, and that he had not been eliminated at this difficult stage of the test. Entering the building, the lecturer told all the students where they should go next, as it was unclear who could continue and who could not. At that moment, all the examinees gathered in the large hall, and the lecturer announced that the last part of the exam had begun, the difficulty of which was that each task would be different. Even if the raiders showed excellent results in the first and second stages, they could fail in the last one, which should be kept in mind. Our hero looked closely at the sheet of paper in front of him, although he couldn't quite understand why it was needed. For a moment, the young man decided that they would now be tested on their writing and presentation skills. At that moment, the lecturer announced that the final part of the qualifying exam would be an essay. The man stated that during the exam, students were not allowed to leave their seats or fidget, otherwise they would be disqualified. They had to write about raiders, or more precisely, about why each of them had decided to choose this profession. Rumors immediately spread throughout the hall that not everyone was able to express their thoughts clearly. Our hero was confused because he did not know if he could write about a video he had once stumbled upon that had inspired him. It was also unclear whether to link his story to his childhood or not. The only thing that was clear was that he did not know where to start writing about his desire to become a raider. Time passed, but Lee Se-min did not even pick up a pencil to start writing because he could not gather his thoughts. When he thinks of raiders, only one person comes to mind. Seeing and remembering this young man, the hero wanted his detractor to stop his dirty games. The reason was that this bad guy always bullied those weaker than himself, calling the hero an orphan and meddling in other people's affairs. At that moment, the young man's memories returned to his childhood, when he stood alone and looked intently at the huge window behind which the snow was falling. By the time the boy had come to terms with the idea that he would remain alone, he was adopted by his current parents. They became his mom and dad, who always saw him as a child in need of love. Despite this, they did not always talk about how much they loved their adopted son, but the feeling was so strong that it could be felt. The young man remembered how one day these people sat him down and began a serious conversation about how everyone is born with a specific purpose. They explained that their task was to raise him and guide him on the right path. Considering that Lee Se-min was still a child at the time, he did not fully understand what his parents were trying to convey to him. One day, our hero opened a trash can and saw some strange envelopes there that greatly intrigued him. Picking up an envelope, the boy thought that perhaps the adults wanted to protect him, since he had recently learned of the death of his biological mother. Lee Se-min read what was written inside, and then put the envelope back. The memories then took the young man to a later period, when his parents gave him advice and told him to eat well and not get too carried away with training. His father noted that his son should not only live up to his name, although the young man did not understand what he was talking about. The man explained that Si meant peace and Min meant people. It turned out that he could become a raider who always helps other people and comes to their aid in the most difficult moments. Bowing to his parents, our hero promised that he would definitely be like that and thanked them for raising him to be a wonderful person. At that moment, the lecturer said that there were 5 minutes left until the end of the exam, and the students had to describe in detail why they decided to become raiders and how they saw the main mission of a hunter. At that moment, Lee Se-min thought about how monsters had taken over humanity, and the only force that could oppose them was aura. However, he did not understand why it had been given to him and what his purpose was in this world. The young man remembered the warrior who stood by the river and told him that he was not an ordinary person and must understand this forever. The mentor went on to say that the young man must become transcendent in order to stop doubting himself. A moment later, the young man remembered his friend after the battle, wishing that the world would become a much better place, even though his friend was now in the hospital. The young man also remembered his mentor, who reassured him and said that he would become an excellent raider and would be able to ensure everyone's safety, while Jay talked about the book. Therefore, the young man decided for himself that the most important things for him were people's trust, as well as peace and tranquility in the world. Realizing that now was not the best time to dwell on memories, especially since the exam had ended a few days ago, our hero decided to ask his friend when he would be discharged. Yinja replied that it would not be soon, and that studying in the hospital ward would not be difficult for him. A moment later, the young man asked his friend if he knew the formula for the square root. The latter smiled jokingly, and added that the young man was still a little dumber than he was. The conversation soon turned to the fact that Ying Jae was planning to become a firefighter, which the guy found amusing. As he was leaving, our hero answered questions and said that they would most likely see each other in 2 years, not sooner. The young man heard his friend say that he was going to visit him, but asked him not to do so. Walking down the street, Lee Se-min remembered how the qualifying exam had ended and how he had been told that he was now being drafted into the army. The young man was devastated. He was sad to waste 2 precious years of his youth on incomprehensible tasks, instead of developing himself and becoming an excellent raider. Despite being on a crowded street, the young man was not afraid, and loudly declared that this was all a real irony of their state. The Immortal Squads were specialized units consisting of awakened individuals who had not passed the qualification tests, and that was where he would soon be sent. He remembered how, just recently, his mentor had said that the young man must acquire his own weapon, although at the time he did not understand why this was necessary. The young man explained that everyone should have their own weapon, since the state would not be able to provide one for everyone. Standing outside the store, our hero bowed his head, seemingly indifferent to everything around him, feeling completely broken and exhausted. Upon entering the store, Lee Seaman heard someone greet him and responded in kind. The saleswoman looked closely at the customer and asked if he was really a resonator, her eyes already boiling with anger and hatred. Listening to the girl, the young man said he wanted to see the branders. The saleswoman explained that the weapon was attractive on the outside but simple on the inside, adding that this was exactly what people said about cleavers. Then the girl said that of course they sell any two-handed swords, so if he wanted to buy one, there would be no problem. Everyone knows that claymores are weapons of great historical significance, and along with Japanese swords, many choose them over modern weapons. While the saleswoman was offering the two-handed sword, the guy thought about how an iron heart makes a great weapon, but the price is high, so most people choose simpler swords. Taking the weapon, the guy decided that there was no point in buying something expensive. Besides, he couldn't afford it. It seemed that Lee Seaman was quite satisfied with what he was holding in his hands, as he felt confident enough. The saleswoman noted that the sword was of excellent quality for a small company from this farmer, and moreover, he could not worry about it and use it without fear. The young man realized that the decision had been made and chose this particular weapon. Leaving the store, the saleswoman cheerfully wished the hero good service, but this annoyed him as he wanted to act independently. Walking down the street, the guy thought that if something couldn't be avoided, then he should try to enjoy it, so he decided to prepare diligently to retake the test. The young man knew for sure that to achieve his goal, he had to keep moving forward. Interesting events were taking place near that flying zone. Corporal Yoon Woo-jae of the Special Forces unit of the Immortals was scolding someone. The reason was that he was angry that the hero had decided to buy a weapon, but instead of explaining, he simply apologized. A moment later, he explained that an acquaintance had suggested he do so earlier. Yoon Woo-jae was annoyed by what had happened. He understood that it was most likely a joke that he had fallen for. The man casually turned to his assistant and said that he had an interesting job for him. Private Yoo Gil-hoon watched the scene intently and thought that it was indeed true. A minute later, she turned to our hero, who responded immediately. Yoo Gil-hoon told the young man to follow her quickly. The guy didn't know what to expect, but decided to focus on his goal and ignore everything unpleasant. The private explained that the corporal always treated new recruits this way, but it was not known whether he would return the weapon. A minute later, the conversation turned to what Lee Seaman, who was also hungry, would like to eat. Sitting at the table, he sincerely thanked his new acquaintance, even though he was his superior. Observing what was happening, the hero came to the conclusion that this place was very different from a regular army, as there was a shortage of people here. Gathering his courage, the young man asked Yoo Gil-hoon if he knew what they did here, since there were so many people. However, he explained that no one knew. Everyone who came here believed that this place was for those who had failed the Raider test, but in reality, it remained a mystery. Now the private asked a strange question about what would happen if he failed to stop the monster. After thinking for a moment, the young man began to wonder what kind of trouble might happen. After thinking for a while, he decided to talk about this topic in more detail. He went on to say that he had heard that in the past there had been a huge crisis in areas where the retro system was not developed, so they received help from neighboring countries. Everyone imagined huge and dangerous formations. But after a minute, Yoo Gil-hoon changed the subject to the fact that they should get up immediately, although he did not explain the main reason. A little time passed, and the young people were already standing on the street, looking somewhere. The soldier calmly addressed our hero and told him to follow him. For someone who had just woken up, it was no problem to jump high enough to reach the upper platform. Despite the fact that Lee Seaman had trained hard, it was still pleasant for him to see something like this. He did not think such skills were possible. But the young man couldn't finish his thought because at that moment the soldier shouted for him to put his doubts aside and climb up to him. The young man couldn't jump that high, so he decided to grab one of the ledges to gain momentum. Yoo Gil-hoon was still watching him intently, but said nothing. A moment passed, and the young man found himself next to the private, although it was not easy for him. Lee Seaman heard the praise and was pleased because it was worth the effort. Looking intently at the mountains, the private asked the young man if he could see anything. Then he added that the northern part of the demilitarized zone was a place where monsters roamed. The young man went on to explain that creatures lived there and that it was a place that should not be entered at all. The hero listened attentively to the story, but remained silent because he did not know how to respond. Yoo Gil-hoon calmly noted that unexpected situations could arise here, as there were too many dangers of all kinds. The young man's expression changed slightly, and his friend said that he was probably scared, although the young man himself began to deny it. Once again, the private looked closely at the fenced-off area. Lee Seaman remained silent, but thought to himself that this was a completely new start for him, and therefore it was worth taking advantage of it. The next day, the young man woke up earlier than he had in a long time. The clock showed 5 in the morning. Even though everyone else was still asleep, he decided to get up and get busy. Stepping out into the hallway, the young man saw his mentor, who was struggling to stay awake. It was obvious that he really wanted to sleep. Knowing our hero, the guy greeted him and said that Lee Seaman was quick to get up so early. The stranger inquired about breakfast and learned that it would be rice, fish soup, kimchi, and fried pork. After that, the young man poured water into a container and headed straight down the corridor. Before he could reach his destination, a voice came over the loudspeaker, announcing that it was time to get up. Finally entering one of the rooms, Lee Saemin pulled back the curtains and also told everyone that it was time to get up. The young man approached Sergeant Kim Huiyin, who clearly had no intention of getting up, and told him that it was morning and time for everyone to get up. So that it wouldn't look silly, our hero suggested drinking some water and said that Captain Han would be conducting the morning roll call. After that, all the guys slowly began to get ready and get dressed. Turning to our hero, the sergeant asked him if he had made his bed and received a satisfactory answer. Only a few minutes passed and all the guys were already standing on the street where the formation was taking place. The sergeant said that soldiers would be arriving after their mission, so they had to make sure the guys got a good rest. The private turned to Lee Seaman and told him that the squad leader was always watching, so they should be on their guard. The guy said he understood, but wanted to know what mission the guys had been on. His new acquaintance replied that he didn't know himself, but had heard that it took place in the northern part. He added that North Korea was almost completely under attack by monsters, and the soldiers were holding several areas, but they were also surrounded by monsters. As a result, South Korea and China had formed their own borders to keep the monsters at bay, helping the North to exterminate the monsters and the South to defend itself. After that, the young man told Lee Saemin not to dare look Sergeant Jong Woo-eun in the eye, as he really dislikes that kind of attitude. Not much time had passed, and the guys were already free and discussing what they would be offered for lunch. Entering one of the rooms, the private greeted the guys and said that they hadn't seen each other in too long. Sergeant Jong Woo-eun immediately noticed our hero and asked who he was, although he immediately heard that he was new. The young man was very tired and said that it would be best to talk after a hot shower. He pointed to his bag and asked the guys to unpack it by the time he was ready. Turning to Lee Seaman, the private honestly said that the smell would probably not wash out even after numerous washes. At that moment, something happened that the guys least expected. Something fell out of the backpack. The sight was gruesome, but Yoo Gil-hoon explained that it was the head of a monster with a system number. Although he did not understand how it ended up in the backpack, our hero thought about the fact that, having received the gold mark, it was possible to hunt and defeat such monsters alone. After getting out of the shower, Jung Woo-eun asked if anything interesting had happened and heard that someone had decided to bring a weapon. He added that someone had said it was necessary for military service, and the guy believed it without knowing if it was true. It seemed that the sergeant was not going to laugh. On the contrary, he was interested in seeing the weapon. It was easy for the young man to show off his sword, and in a few minutes, it was already in his hands. The sergeant watched the cold weapon closely, seemingly intrigued by it. Jung Woo-eun asked the young man his name decisively. To make sure the young man understood, the sergeant repeated the question in a stern tone and asked what his name was. The young man asked if Lee Saemin liked his weapon, or if he had bought it because he needed something. Hearing that the purchase had brought him pleasure, the sergeant noted that if that was the case, then he could use it exclusively from now on. He asked again whether our hero had been preparing to become a raider, and whether it was true that it didn't work out, and he ended up in the army. It turned out that this man was not indifferent to the fate of the young man, so he noted that he was tired and wanted to rest. But later they would definitely return to this conversation. Yoo Gil-hoon saw that his new acquaintance was smiling, and understood that he was happy to be able to use his own sword. Although he immediately added that he had never seen such a gentle expression on the sergeant's face, it seemed that our hero had somehow managed to win this man over. However, when he looked at the company that had worn out the weapon, he noticed that it was the sergeant's father's company, which was why he had allowed them to use it. After a while, answering a private's question, Sergeant Jong admitted that he was not afraid, because if you do everything by the rules, you can leave the battlefield unharmed, but if you make even one mistake, you will die. Standing in the corridor, Yoo Gil-hoon once again told our hero that with his beautiful sword, he looked like a great warrior. A short time passed, and all the guys were back in the evening mood. The sergeant loudly called out to Lee Seaman, addressing the newcomer. A moment later, the young man asked who Brooks was and heard that his system number was 23, and that he was also known as the Earth Dog. The guy added that they have strong jaws and sharp teeth, and they attack in packs, so it is quite difficult to deal with them. Sometimes, a warrior Brooks can be found among them, whose size and attack power exceed that of a normal Brooks, which is why some classify these monsters as two different species. The sergeant asked the guy if he had ever studied monsters, but he proudly declared that he was just an ordinary person and simply wanted to become a raider. At that moment, the guys began to exchange glances, saying that among their squad, Lee Seaman was a real ace. The sergeant continued to explain that in addition to Brooks having a hard outer shell, it also had a softer part, namely its stomach. The chief immediately explained that due to the monster's poor eyesight, the stomach was its blind spot, but it was necessary to attack quickly. If you miss, the sword will bounce back and the warrior could injure himself, so everyone would practice their strikes together. Taking his sword, our hero happily thought about how he hadn't trained with such a weapon in a long time, so he was glad about this. Only a few minutes had passed, and the guys had already started practicing, and it was clear that they were all doing well. Lee Saemin also wielded his sword as if he were on a real battlefield. Once again, the private turned to the young man and said that he was really good, and had shown a lot of what he was capable of. He then began to compliment the young man, saying that he was a true genius, although the young man felt a little awkward hearing this. However, the young men did not have time to finish their conversation, because at that very moment, an air raid siren sounded, which was a rather rare occurrence. Suddenly, someone from the command shouted that a general assembly was being called because Brooks had been discovered, and therefore the weak points that had been discussed just recently needed to be exploited. The sergeant also shouted that the cadets had no right to die, as their families would suffer for their deaths. The next moment, there was a loud explosion, and someone from the command shouted that now was the time to attack. The explosion was caused by one of the targets stepping on a mine, making it a little easier to determine the enemy's location. At the same time, the young people knew that they had to be as careful as possible. First, to make sure that there were no monsters nearby, and second, to watch where they were stepping. Although in terms of the monster, everything was simpler, since they were not hiding and were already in a large group in the clearing where the guys had come out. For a moment, it seemed as if time had frozen, but the sergeant immediately shouted for everyone to take their positions. The young man knew very well what combat was, so he was not going to delay and told everyone to go on the attack. No one was going to disobey, so our heroes, along with the rest, tried to figure out which side would be best to attack from in order to inflict the most damage. The cadets were as confident as possible and told each other that they needed to crush these monsters and get back to dinner. The sergeant saw that Lee Seaman was not going to hide behind the backs of others. However, he should not go forward, because he was a novice and simply did not know much. But a minute later, something happened that no one expected, as one of the opponents touched the young man from behind. The young man was not going to hesitate. He knew that not only his life was at stake, but also the lives of the other boys, so he struck decisively. The sergeant watched everything closely, but he wasn't going to intervene, at least not at that moment. The young man understood that there were many opponents in this place, and therefore there would be enough for everyone to deal with someone. The guys were doing their job in the best possible way, especially after receiving clear instructions. At that moment, our hero was joined by his new comrade, who immediately began to compliment him on his strength. However, there was no time to give up, so Lee Se-min thought to himself that the battle would be long, as there was no end to these monsters. The soldiers fought bravely, although they did not have enough strength to defeat everyone on their own. Moreover, something unpredictable happened a minute later, as the warrior Brucus found himself right in front of one of the commanders. The cadets saw what had happened and watched in horror, realizing that they had to stop this monster. Realizing that something was wrong, the crowd began to shout at the young people to stop standing there and help their comrade. No one could fully understand where this warrior Brucus had come from. It seemed that the young people had calculated everything, but that was not the case. Lee Se-ming, despite having seen a lot in his life, watched the events unfold intently and couldn't move. For a moment, he was transported back to the day when his best friend decided to fight the monsters, even though he was not a raider. Jay was not afraid of anything. He simply knew that he had to protect the people who were with him. This memory gave the young man strength, and so he desperately grabbed the hilt of his cold weapon. While the private was saying something, the young man was already heading towards the enemies, listening to no one and nothing. It turned out that the monster was about to devour the man, who could not resist it because he was on the ground. However, at that moment, help arrived in the form of a young man who immediately began swinging his sword. Lee Se-min thought that he had encountered a strong opponent who was clearly different from the usual Brucus. The guy understood that he had consciousness. That was good, even though it was quite difficult to get close enough to the monster to even try to inflict some damage. The young man thought for a moment, then realized that he already had a plan of action. The battle began again, but at that moment, the guy began to think about what else could interfere with the monster and stop it. At that moment, he decided that he needed to use more force to show the monster that it was not as powerful as he had thought at first. After the blow, Lee Se-min realized that he had managed to inflict at least a small amount of damage, and that was encouraging. The bosses were watching everything closely, and it turned out that they didn't understand how it had come to this, but the young man didn't care. The most important thing was that he had managed to do what he had set out to do, and he had done it only to save people. Turning around, our heroes proudly walked away from this terrible beast. The young people who were in the field also said that they didn't like these monsters, but the only way to stop them was to fight them. Realizing that the battle was not over yet, the guy decided to let the beasts attack so that they could be finished off as quickly as possible. By morning, the battle was over, and thanks to him, a large number of monsters had been eliminated, but the wounded were also carried away from the battlefield. The sergeant first turned to Lee Se-min, although he did not understand what they wanted from him. The young man stood rooted to the spot, not knowing what to expect from this conversation. A moment later, the sergeant praised the young man, saying that he had done everything right, and then asked how it was possible that the young man had failed the raider exam. Lee Se-min, concentrating, noted that he had written poorly, which was not good and would cause great surprise. After that, the young man offered his boss some water, but he saw the blood-stained flask and refused. The next day, rumors spread about the talented young man who had easily defeated the monsters. In the hallway, the guys discussed what they would have for breakfast, and one of them described the menu in detail, as he was on kitchen duty. When the young people left, the guy thought about how he would continue to train hard to maintain his new status, which was very pleasant. A moment later, John Wooen approached our hero and informed him that rumors of his exploits had reached the highest levels. He added that there were rumors that he had single-handedly destroyed a Brucus warrior, although Lee Se-min immediately began to feel embarrassed, putting his hand on his subordinate's shoulder. The sergeant said that this was unnecessary, because he had actually done a wonderful thing. He then asked the young man to follow him. Only a few minutes passed, and the men were already standing in the field with their swords. Jong Wooen ordered his subordinate to hold his sword as tightly as possible, although he couldn't understand why. the sergeant looked closely at the young man and asked if he had ever participated in sparring. Hearing a satisfactory answer, a moment later, the man placed his weapon on the floor to begin the competition. A minute later, he shouted for the cadets to try to block him. Lee Se-min couldn't understand anything because everything happened so quickly, but his intuition began to tell him what to do. The young man was proud of himself because he did what was required of him quite quickly. Despite this, his opponent did not stop. It seemed that he was going to continue, perhaps until he slightly injured his subordinate. The young man understood this, and moreover, realized that his opponent's speed was simply lightning fast. The guy knew that each blow was more powerful than the last, and he felt as if the sergeant had been practicing one technique for a very long time. Stopping, John Woo-in noted that it was quite good, and then suggested that the hero begin the attack himself. The young man started talking about the sword, but the boss interrupted him, noting that they were made in the same place, and that the model belonged to a high-end company. He said that he was familiar with our hero's model, which was a training sword, and that it possessed elegance and power. The sergeant noted that the cadet had excellent taste, and moreover pointed out that Lee Se-min would be able to use only this weapon in the future. The guys standing nearby watched the sword, and the scene between the brother and the sergeant looked really exciting. It was also interesting that our hero was doing quite well, which his colleagues happily noted. The guys knew that the training could go on for a long time, so they didn't see the point in just standing around and wasting their time. It wasn't easy for Lee Se-min. He understood that every step under the supervision of his boss was important. Missing just one strike could put him on the brink of death. This was a completely different level that the young man had never encountered before. For a moment, he remembered the battle in the forest when his partner was UB. However, there was no time to think, and in the next minute, the guy delivered a crushing blow with all his might. John Woo-in, who did not expect anything like this, backed away and thought that he was facing a unique young man capable of extraordinary actions. Sometime after the sparring ended, the sergeant praised his subordinate, noting that he was capable of incredible things. The chief asked if the young man thought he could become an excellent raider after his service. Lee Se-min knew for sure that he had a worthy opponent, so she said that the man was incredibly strong and could become an excellent fighter. The sergeant noted that many skills are acquired in this very place, and the young man wondered if he would be able to master something similar. On the way to the location, Jung Woo-enu said that he had once volunteered for a mission so as not to end his service without results. A minute later, he added that his father was ashamed that he had failed the raider exam. Hearing his subordinate's question about the situation abroad, the young man paused for a moment, then said that it was hell there. Our hero understood that it was difficult for the sergeant to talk about it, so he decided not to ask for details. The man himself replied that the mission was in North Korea, as they had been informed of threats there, but no details were given. He added that if the young man was so interested, he could go there once. The sergeant continued that it was obvious without saying how interesting it was to observe what was happening abroad. Lee Se-min thoughtfully noted that he just wanted to ask his boss's opinion. A few hours later, interesting events began to unfold at the guard post. A young man standing nearby began asking about a deer-like monster that had been spotted nearby. The young man immediately explained that these were monster pests with the system number 11, characterized by huge horns, which required extreme caution as their bodies began to rot upon contact. The guy asked if Lee Se-min would try to continue his raider career after leaving this place, and upon hearing a satisfactory answer, he said that he would probably give up on that dream. However, his colleague stated that he would most likely give up on this dream. With some irritation in his voice, the cadet noted that if the best fail, what can be said about the others? He added that he had tried more than once, but ended up here, which meant that there was more to life than just being a raider. The young man did not like such oppression, so he said that the young man would succeed, and if he still had nothing to do, he could try his hand at the modeling industry. After that, the guys started shining their flashlights to see what else was going on there. But after a moment, something strange and unusual happened, because the young people thought they saw someone's leg. The cadets didn't know who or what it was, so they got a little nervous. The senior private immediately turned to Lee Se-min and told him to immediately notify the squad about the emergency. The frightened young man said that an unidentified object was approaching them from the north, most likely a young man, but it was impossible to say for sure. The stranger in white robes was simply standing in the middle of the restricted area, and it turned out that he had been there more than once. Our heroes immediately wanted to attack, but they said they had no right to cross the territory without special permission and orders. Despite this, the predator and the unknown young man were getting closer with every passing minute. The guys saw that the monster could harm the young man at any moment, so they started shouting at him to run away. At that moment, the monster grabbed the stranger by the arm and showed no signs of stopping. The boys watched as the terrifying monster tore the unfortunate man's arm apart. He stood there and growled desperately for someone to help him or assist him. The young people watching everything from their vantage point thought that the man was falling somewhere. However, despite this, they still could not do anything, and moreover, they had not heard anything about the stranger since then. After a while, our people turned to the Avrils and asked if it was true that a new group was being formed for the mission. Yunshu honestly admitted that she would like to join it. However, the young man, citing the sergeant as an example, said that even he, who was well trained, often returned from missions battered and bruised, and most of the soldiers were in critical condition. After a short pause, he added that there were also guys who didn't return at all, although the young man continued to stand his ground. The young man said that, first of all, he wanted to become stronger, and secondly, he would actually find out what was going on there. Getting up from the table, the man noted that since the conversation had come up, Lee Saemin could actually go and see for himself. At that moment, one of the cadets knocked on the door and heard permission to enter. Seeing that the corporal was busy, the young man apologized and said that in that case, they would come back another time. However, upon hearing the permission, the young people noted that they wanted to join the volunteer mission. Yoon Woo-jae was silent, seemingly unsure of how to respond in such a situation. However, after a moment, he asked if privates could really visit the mission. Suddenly, the chief asked again in a different voice if the cadets wanted to join the general team. And while Lee Saemin was thinking about what the sergeant had said, his comrade Orda declared that they also intended to take part in the mission. The man at the table fell silent for a moment, apparently thinking about his answer. However, a moment later, the chief asked our hero and his comrade, who had better said their names. Silence fell upon the room once again, and the senior officer looked intently at the young men, but did not rush to announce his decision. However, a minute later, he put his hand on the private's shoulder and said that it was an excellent idea and, moreover, a wonderful attitude. The guys were pleased to hear this, especially since they were told they were welcome, which meant that the doors to this mission were open to them. After a while, the cadets' vehicles were driving through the forest in a familiar direction. One of the guys asked our heroes why they had suddenly decided to join this mission. Lee Saemin didn't know what to say, while Yoon Woo-jae thought for a moment. However, he immediately replied that it was time for him to become a sergeant, adding that if anyone beat him up, it would be someone outside the army, so he thought it would be nice to become someone like their sergeant. He immediately continued by saying that he had a funny new recruit, so he could try his hand at combat with him. The young man hugged the boy so that he would follow him properly in North Korea. Otherwise, he would become a sewing machine upon his return. The guy didn't get the joke, but his comrade explained that upon his return, he would only be good for darning socks. Not much time had passed, and the team members had already gathered in the hall, where they listened to speeches about how grateful they were for joining the ranks. The chief announced that their destination was Kanhon, in the province of Pyeonggan-namdo, where the young men would meet with the garrison and then return. At that moment, there were questions about what the guys were doing with the North Koreans and whether they were encountering them. But the team was told that this was classified information. Realizing that there were no more questions, he added that they would be leaving immediately after lunch. Seeing the major, our hero asked if this man was there, although he did not specify where exactly. Looking somewhere ahead, one of the commanders thought that there was something scary in this man's eyes, although he did not specify who he was talking about. Sometime after crossing the demilitarized zone, the guys had to walk along a bad and dirty road. The main reason for this decision was that monsters are sensitive to exhaust fumes and smoke. Yoon Woo-jae immediately said that Sergeant Jong had told everyone that there was nothing special here, but so far they hadn't seen anything unusual. Looking around, Lee Saemin said with some apprehension that it was indeed suspiciously quiet in this place. One of the guys immediately pointed out that if there were no animals in the forest, then the reason was obvious. It was that there were too many monsters here, and no animal had a chance to hide. For a moment, our hero's friend thought about something and stopped. Watching the mana form in his hands, he thought to himself that for some reason he was starting to feel nervous, even though that wasn't like him. Taking his brother by the hand, our hero shouted so loudly that the young man was a little frightened. Pointing to his leg, the guy noted that he felt something strange right under the stitch in the dirt. At that moment, something exploded under their feet, so strongly that all the guys were thrown in different directions. The main commanders, realizing that something was wrong, immediately said to each other that it was Statum. They were talking about pest monsters, which were of an unusual species, hid in the ground and then exploded, delivering a series of shockwave attacks. The corporal looked carefully in front of him. He was scared, but tried not to show it so as not to lose control. The young man grabbed the guy and shouted something to him, realizing that they might lose him. The man did not want to lose his friend, who could fall into the hole that had formed, so he shouted for him to wake up, even though he had already come to his senses. Jumping to the ground, Lee Saemin honestly said that he was grateful to his mentor, because if it weren't for him, he would no longer be alive. Taking a defensive stance, Yoon Woo-jae asked his former subordinate if he was ready for battle, and if he knew how to defend himself, receiving a satisfactory answer. The man explained that when Statum senses a human presence, it burrows underground, so it is necessary to hide in the sand and wait for the right moment to attack. It wasn't the most enjoyable activity, but the young men understood that this was the only way they could not only survive, but also destroy the enemy. Despite its apparent simplicity, the task was not easy, but the soldiers coped with it perfectly. Only a few minutes passed, and the guys had already jumped out of their ambush, ready to start the battle. He did not understand what this strange entity was, which was not really visible, but he was not going to give up, planning to fight to the end. Realizing that he himself could defeat the enemy, the man ordered our hero to check on his comrades and help them if necessary. Lee Saemin immediately rushed to help, and at the first tree, noticed a young man clutching his side. Responding to the frightened young man's questions, his comrade said that he would most likely not survive the injury. Our hero did not understand whether the wound was caused by the explosion or by the enemy, but he continued to reassure his comrade, saying that everything would be fine. A moment later, the young man noticed Major Kim Kyu-jin, who seemed to be somehow drawing mana from his opponents. It looked so skillful, professional, and at the same time frightening that our hero couldn't comprehend how such a thing was even possible. Lee Saman froze in place, wanting to ask something but unable to do so. Interestingly, a few minutes later, the young man was holding a small suitcase in his hands. The young man continued to look intently at his boss, wondering to himself where this suitcase came from and what was inside it. After a while, having dealt with all the monsters, Kim Kyu-jin thanked the cadets, adding that they were very brave. The young man said that since they were close to the base, the wounded should return. But it should be remembered that after that, such cadets would no longer be able to join them. At that moment, the sergeant said aloud that this place was actually hell. And while one of the guys noted that Statham was a rare monster, someone else added that all this information could be false, because the whole forest was full of dangers. Only a few days had passed, and the whole group was on the third stage of the mission. In 3 days, they had 3 major and 5 minor battles, in which they suffered heavy losses. Suddenly, the commander raised his hand and said that this was the best place to make a stop. He emphasized once again that everyone must be extremely careful. The second commander added that in any case, they must not lose their vigilance, as anything could happen. Many soldiers were angry that they were not being given any real explanation, realizing that they were just pawns in this serious mission. Lee Seaman was also curious about where they were and where they were going. So he asked this question, but after receiving an answer, he did not ask any more questions. Looking at his hand, he decided that there was no point in wasting time and asking unnecessary questions. Seeing the bright green glow, the young man froze for a moment, mesmerized by such changes. He reflected on the fact that the further north they traveled, the stronger his aura became for some reason. It was clear to our hero that something was definitely affecting him, although he couldn't understand the real reason. A moment later, the guy froze when he heard some strange footsteps and decided that someone was heading straight for them. Lee Saman shouted loudly that monsters were rapidly approaching them, convinced that he had made the right conclusions. The guys standing nearby didn't seem to fully believe it, but the young man asked them to come closer because he could sense several creatures. Grabbing his sword, the young man shouted loudly at his enemies to finally stop hiding and come out. With each passing second, the footsteps grew louder and clearer. A moment later, strangers appeared before the boys and remarked that their comrades from the south were quite energetic. He then said that his name was Lee Gil-han and that he was definitely not a monster, so there was no need to fear him. After that, the commanders began to discuss the fact that the number of monsters had increased slightly, and moreover, there were noticeable changes in their behavior. A moment later, the man asked if they had brought him what they were supposed to. The chief had already raised his hand, signaling his assistant to show the case. Our hero had seen this small suitcase before, but he had no idea what was inside it. Once again, the commander asked with an icy stare if the young people would check the contents, but they replied in the negative. In that case, the private asked what it could be, stacks of cash or gold bars. But Lee Seaman remarked indifferently that it was better not to think about it, since they didn't know what was really in there. After that, his comrade pointed out that he had panicked prematurely by saying that monsters were approaching them, adding that people also make mistakes from time to time. Switching to another topic, our hero asked if he was interested in why they were risking their lives. The man also said that they didn't really know, and that based on his experience, it was sometimes better to close your eyes and cover your ears. Thinking about it, the young man did not know if this was the right decision, since he had always strived for something, but he decided not to argue. Even though it was night, the group of young men continued to move forward. Responding to the senior commander's question about whether all the guys from the unknown team had returned, he said that everyone had returned. He added that he was very sorry that the squad our hero was in had lost so many people, noting that he hoped their families would be taken care of. At that moment, the whole group stopped and began to listen carefully to something. Seeing the power indicator, they said it would be best to disperse at this location. The stranger replied that he had already said that the monster's behavior had changed, and that there was a whole crowd ahead, so it would be better to go around them. The man continued to note that there were too many kinesis in this place. He added humorously that if anyone didn't believe him, they could see for themselves. There was a moment of silence, and the commander looked at the stranger with indifference but distrust, while the stranger stood and smiled. At that moment, Lee Saman and the corporal did not understand why they had stopped so suddenly, and therefore felt a sense of inner anxiety. A moment later, the other guys started talking, curious about what their bosses were saying. The corporal couldn't understand what kinesis meant, although the young man immediately suggested that they were plant monsters. He added that they say they look like monsters, and the monsters stand still, but as soon as they spot their prey, they pounce on it like lightning. The guys heard this story and began to compliment the young man, saying that he was very smart. The stranger suddenly turned to the cadet and said that he did not see name tags on their uniforms, but they replied that they were not as wealthy as South Koreans. In a softer tone, the man added that he would like to meet their comrades from the South in person. Realizing that he had to give his name, our hero blurted it out, saying that it was actually great that they had met. Yun Saman waited for the stranger to introduce himself, and he said that they saw the point in doing so, since it was their first and last meeting. The young man was not at all embarrassed, because he noticed something that was literally at his fingertips. A moment later, he also noticed it and shouted along with his partner. In front of the guys were large, beautiful roses, but everyone understood that this was just a disguise, and that they were actually monsters. The young people who found themselves in the center began to shout loudly that they had somehow fallen into a trap. The captain grabbed the stranger by the scruff of his neck and began to call him the most indecent names, saying that he had led them to the wrong place. However, the stranger mockingly replied that he seemed to have simply made a slight mistake, and that the monsters were located here. not a little further away, as he had thought. Responding to the captain's question about why this had been done, the man calmly stated that he already knew the answer to his question. The corporal, realizing that they would not be able to cope with such a large number of kinesis, immediately began to argue that it would be best for them to retreat. But a minute later, complete chaos ensued, as it turned out that no one knew where to run or to whom. Looking at his private, he decided that he was in good shape, and therefore they had a chance of winning. However, everything would have been fine, but the stranger was not going to let the guys go just like that, which he told them. The commander had no intention of giving up, so he drew his sword and began to concentrate his mana, realizing that the battle would be difficult. Not much time had passed before the battle began, and in this case, there were two opponents. Dodging a devastating blow, the commander did not immediately understand what was happening. It seemed to him that such a thing simply could not be. The reason was that somehow the stranger was fighting alongside the demons, or rather, with them. However, the other guys weren't standing still either, knowing that they had to prove themselves. At that moment, Lee Seaman frantically began calling for the corporal, not understanding where he had gone, since he had been standing next to him just a moment ago. Yoon Woo-jae realized that he couldn't ignore his comrade because he was practically right next to him. One of the soldiers also turned to our hero, saying that they would not be able to resist these monsters, and therefore the best decision would be to flee. The battle was extremely difficult because the captain was not alone in facing the stranger. He had to fight both the monsters and his enemies. The latter felt extremely confident and invincible, believing that no one could defeat him anyway. The commander knew that he was not going to give up, so he acted as persistently as possible. It was not easy for Kim Kyu-jin. He shouted, "While I was away, a coup took place here?" However, the enemy laughed and mocked the captain, saying that he was stupid and didn't understand anything. Kim Kyu-jin looked closely at his detractor and simultaneously formed his mana. The stranger did not think that the captain was so strong, so he did not intend to exert himself too much. But in a moment, the young man was holding completely unimaginable things in his hands, which seemed more like an exception to the rule than the norm. The opponent was angry because he clearly did not expect anything like this. He did not like this combination, nor the power. For a moment, the men switched to hand-to-hand combat, perhaps realizing that they would be able to resolve something there. At that moment, the commander shouted to Lee Gil-han that he should not be underestimated, because he was also capable of many things. Then something unexpected happened, because the villain threw his blade at the lieutenant. The young man lay on the ground, seemingly unable to get up or do anything else. He looked as bad as could be, and one might think that the wound would cost him his life. At that moment, the flower, which was actually a monster, came as close as possible to the man. After lying down for a while, the lieutenant gathered his hands together and got up. What's more, he tried to pull the knife out of his shoulder. A minute later, the lieutenant was growling as if something had possessed him. Lee Seaman, who watched everything with horror, thought that they had a problem and that their boss had lost his mind, so they could all die. Suddenly, turning to the corporal, the young man said that he had to continue on his way and asked the others to follow him, realizing that they had no other choice anyway. The young people desperately fought the harmful plants, realizing that this was the only way they could really do something. Looking into the distance, our hero decided that they had a wonderful opportunity, so he turned to his friend. However, the latter was sitting on the floor and did not respond to his calls. At that moment, it became clear that everything was out of control, because the monsters were only getting stronger, and the soldiers were trying with all their might to get away from them. In the midst of all this horror, Lee Seaman knew for sure that they had to get away, and as soon as possible. However, there was one problem that bothered Yoon, so he stood rooted to the spot. The young man continued to grip his sword, while his mana grew stronger and more powerful with each passing minute. Wielding his sword, our hero knew perfectly well that he had to save his comrades, and then hide in a safe place. Realizing that he had survived and was apparently not seriously injured, the guy turned to him and told him to get up as soon as possible. A moment later, the young man approached him and helped him up, saying that now was not the best time to give up. Lee Seaman repeatedly reassured Kim Kyu-jin that they were much stronger than all these troubles, and would therefore definitely survive. Moreover, they would tell everyone that this place was actually hell on earth, and that it was better not to come here. At that moment, the ill-wisher and traitor grabbed the grenade pin, declaring that no one would leave the battlefield just like that. Our hero watched everything closely, his eyes frozen in genuine horror, but he had no intention of remaining inactive. Then something happened that no one expected, as a grenade was thrown literally a meter away from them. All he remembers is that some powerful energy blast threw him and the corporal to the side. Lee Seaman lay on the ground and stared intently in front of him, feeling so weak and powerless that he didn't even want to think about anything. Finding the strength within himself, the young man reached for his sword, knowing that no one would ever let him go anyway. Only a minute had passed, and the young man already saw the enemy in front of him, wondering how it was possible that he was still alive. And taking his sword, he continued in an angry voice, adding that Lee Seaman was actually as resilient as could be. Our hero, despite feeling very ill, still got up and even planned to strike back. But then something incredible happened, as some powerful force struck the villain, and it all happened so quickly that he couldn't understand what was going on. Our hero was also confused. Moreover, he could barely stand and realized that he was about to collapse to the ground. In a semi-conscious state, the guy asked the corporal if he was okay, and added that he couldn't get up, so he asked for help. The young man wanted to grab someone's hand, continuing to say that they should get out of this place and then return to camp. Losing consciousness, the private repeatedly addressed Kim Kyu-jin, convinced that this was the person standing in front of him. The man looked intently at Lee Seaman, but remained completely silent, his eyes glassy. The young man fell, and since all his strength was already at its limit, he did everything he could to stay conscious. Although with each passing second his eyelids grew heavier and heavier, he realized that without outside help, he would not be able to get up. Approaching our hero, the stranger said that he had acted cunningly because he wanted to escape, that Southerners had no moral obligations whatsoever. Seeing the sword rising in someone's hand, the young man told himself over and over again that he had to get up and run away somewhere. With difficulty moving his hand, Lee Seaman continued to think about how tired he was and how he just wanted to rest. Looking around, the guy realized that he was in some unfamiliar room, something resembling a hospital. The guy, who had barely gotten up, tried to remember where he was and how he got there. However, sitting on the bed, he just stared blankly at one spot because nothing sensible came to mind. Reaching for his sword, the young man wanted to know if there were any other survivors besides himself. Bringing his weapon closer to him, he looked at everything, and the main reason was incomprehension. The last thing he remembered was the dark eyes of a man who was looking at him intently. All these thoughts tormented his soul, so our hero told himself that it was better not to remember what had happened on that road. For several minutes, Lee Seaman just sat and stared at the wall, as if expecting to see some answers there. But after a moment, the exhausted young man returned to bed, realizing that even sitting there was difficult for him. Although a moment later, the guy began to hum a song about meat to himself in order to drive away his disturbing thoughts. At that moment, a gray-haired old man entered the room and announced that he had to check the breathing of this young man. The young man's psyche was visibly shaken, so he suddenly jumped out of bed, pointed his sword at the stranger, and told the barbarian to die. However, Lee Seaman was surprised to find that there was no one in front of him, and there was no one else in the room either. The young man did not understand anything, thinking that he was beginning to see some kind of incomprehensible ghosts. But what he noticed next shocked him, as right behind him, practically above his head, an elderly man was levitating. The man explained that he had simply decided to play a joke, as the young man was pretending to be asleep, and then asked how the young man would react to his savior. After punching our hero in the stomach, the old man began to get angry that he was being treated so carelessly, noting that it was disrespectful. He added that, judging by all appearances, the young man was a raider, and said that he would not hit him anymore, realizing that he was wounded. Lee Seaman remembered that he was standing before a legendary master who lived alone in the land of monsters, and had accidentally met the young man, passing on his knowledge to him. Apologizing, the young man said that he simply did not recognize the great master, and then decided to introduce himself. Apocalypse Shaolin noticed that the guy had read too many of his novels, which was not a good thing. Still not understanding who this man was, the young man asked again. But the old man asked him to explain in more detail, because he did not understand why Lee Seaman exuded such strong energy. It was pure, harmonious, and free, as if the young man could become anyone, and at the same time, no, this energy was spread throughout the universe. And, looking at the surprised young man, the old man noted one more detail, that it was the energy of chaos. Lee Seaman listened to the old man with surprise, not understanding what kind of retribution he was talking about. Moreover, our hero wanted to know what had happened to the other soldiers. With a note of sadness in his voice, Apocalypse Shaolin noted that almost all of the soldiers from the southern lands had perished, and the people's army had immediately retreated. The man paused for a moment to give the young man time to think about his words. Then, he said that the one who had abandoned the young man, as well as the one who had emitted the strange energy, had survived. When the young man asked his savior if he could return, the old man said that he himself did not know. After a while, climbing a hill, the old man finally revealed his real name, which turned out to be No Hakjai. Hearing this man's insidious name, the young man said frankly that the man was not from the north, and the man confirmed that this was indeed true. Responding to our hero's question about how he ended up in these parts, he said that he had come here for a short time, simply because he had one thing to do. A moment later, the man offered Lee Seaman something to eat, saying that he must be very hungry. Seeing that they would be having ramen for lunch, the young man was very surprised, not understanding where it had come from. But the old man calmly replied that he had just gone to the store. After a while, the men came to a small clearing where there was a stove and several plates of food. The emboldened young man, seeing that No Hakjai was going somewhere, asked him in alarm where he was going, and heard that the old man just wanted to take a walk. Before leaving, he asked our hero not to think about anything, but to focus entirely on his recovery, because health was the most important thing right now. The young man wanted to ask many more questions, so he shouted something after his new acquaintance, although the latter pretended not to pay any attention to him. Left completely alone, Lee Seaman thought that when he was left alone with his own thoughts, they became even more numerous, concerning both the army and his parents. The young man understood that his mother and father would surely be worried, not knowing where he was. However, after a while, the young man decided that focusing on his health was really wonderful. After a few days, there were no significant changes, although the young man believed that he had made progress. Unwrapping a package, the young man turned to No Hakjai. The young man wanted to know why the old man had come to this place, so he asked him about it again and again, saying that it was quite strange. But Hakjai only said that if the young man was really so curious, he would show him something, especially since the young man had already grown much stronger. Hearing that the old man was suggesting they go somewhere before lunch, the young man was furious, as he had not expected this to happen right now. However, no Hokjae was completely indifferent. He sped up and easily covered several meters, as if it were only a few centimeters. Trying to catch up with the old man, the young man ran after him and shouted that if he wanted to, they could go anywhere right now. Realizing that the old man was far ahead, the young man thought to himself that the old man wasn't walking, he was literally flying, and therefore it was very difficult to catch up with him. After a while, the men were sitting on one of the branches, looking into the distance. Finally, Lee Seaman noticed a building and asked if it was true that it was a People's Army base. Upon hearing that it was, he learned that there was evil there. Our hero did not understand what evil he was talking about, so he decided to ask him directly. After a short pause, the old man explained that it was true, but that it was important to understand that this was the location of the passage leading to hell. Lee Seaman kept remembering his mentor's words, thinking and thinking about the passage leading to hell, not knowing what it meant. Perhaps the old man was saying that, how could he not drink, while the young man was thinking about how this place could hardly be called paradise. Seeing the old man actively drinking from the flask, the young man asked for a sip, but heard that he should not even talk. A minute later, the man spoke again about the place, though he was in no hurry to reveal everything, saying only that the People's Army was conducting some kind of tests that were very dangerous. The young man found this hard to believe, but no Hokjae said that it was indeed true, and that they were using enormous power to do so. However, the main nuance was that the South Koreans were no different from them. They did not know what was going on there, but they insisted that they had nothing to do with it. The young man did not understand what this meant, but the old man explained that it was about an ominous force that should not be there. The men fell silent because they heard something that caught their attention. A second later, the silhouette of a soldier appeared in front of them, watching them intently, though silently. Suddenly, this man said that he sensed something strange, and then asked the old man about our hero, not understanding who he was. The young man did not know who this military man was, but he could clearly sense his aura, realizing that it was exactly the same as it had been in the darkness at. The old man knew this man well, because he addressed him as Park Min-cheol, and said that he thought he was in Gangshan, although the man replied that he had heard otherwise. But Hokjae calmly thanked the man, saying he was glad he had come to meet him. After that, the old man turned to our hero and told him to come as close as possible to the stranger. Park Min-cheol took his knife, and at that moment, the young man thought that he would most likely have to fight this man. Lee Seaman didn't like this idea, even though his savior said that he had encountered a malicious man who pretended to want to help him a little. The young man realized that it was just a ploy because he doubted that the old man could handle this person, even though he had heard that despite his gray hair, he was not that weak. Our hero thought to himself that he could clearly sense this man's strength and knew that he was an excellent master. But there was still one thing. That was that Park Min-cheol was actually dangerous, and he looked like a beast in human form. A moment later, the young man noticed a detractor who rushed at the men, saying why they talked so much and did so little. The old man immediately kicked Lee Seaman, telling him to get out of the way and not get in the way. If someone else had poked our hero, he would have simply fallen on the spot. But the old man's strength was incredible, and so the young man flew straight into the forest. The young man realized that his savior had considerable power and was no ordinary person. The young man began to worry about the old man, but he believed that this adult knew exactly what he was doing. At that moment, a monster appeared before our hero, and the young man recognized it as a Jarga. Suddenly, the young man's hand automatically reached for his sword, but he remembered that he had left it in the clearing where they had been resting. At that moment, the beast was getting closer and closer, and it seemed that it was about to attack. Lee Seaman stood rooted to the spot, having no idea what to do, given that he had no weapons or anything else that could help him. Intuitively, the young man began to raise his hand to his Jarga, although he himself did not understand why he was doing this. A moment later, the young man was stroking the predator as if it were his pet that had been with him for many years. At that moment, our hero remembered the words about death, or perhaps he was telling himself that he did not want to die, or maybe someone had reminded him of this. Lee Seaman affectionately addressed this monster as a friend and suggested that they go together. Only a few minutes passed, and the predator was already walking alongside the young man, as if it had been tamed long ago. Approaching the river, the guy knelt down on one knee, clearly wanting to scoop up some water to give the animal a drink. A few minutes later, Lee Seaman asked the predator if it wanted to eat, assuming that it must be so. Throwing the beast a large piece of raw steak, the young man said that it would surely be able to eat it, given its enormous teeth. And while the animal was eating, the young man thought about how, not long ago, his main goal was to pass the Raider exam immediately after finishing his military service. However, now the young man was sitting in the forest with some kind of incomprehensible monster and waiting for an even more incomprehensible outcome. The guy closed his eyes, clearly troubled by something, but he couldn't quite figure out what it was. For a moment, Lee Seaman was transported back to the time when he was just a regular chubby kid who spent all day on the computer. However, the young man seemed to be watching himself from the outside, now carefully studying his past self. It all seemed extremely strange, unusual, and unfamiliar. Moreover, it turned out that the young man in the past somehow felt as if he were in the future. Although he looked quite sad, he resembled a zombie more than our hero. Suddenly, Lee Seaman from the past jumped up and began to threaten the guy from the present. The young man growled and screamed, looking like an enraged beast that was dissatisfied with something. However, at that moment, Our hero returned to the present and saw the animal begin to growl and bare its teeth at him, about to bite. Lee Seaman didn't like any of this, but despite that, he continued to treat the predator like a baby, thinking that it was just expressing its animal nature. The young man thought with some bitterness that he had even fed this monster. A little later, dipping his hands into the pond, the guy thought to himself that animals are like that, and that this predator was only obeying him temporarily. But instincts always prevail over reason. Once again, Lee Seaman's memories took him back to the time when he was on a mission, although a second later, the young man was looking at his bright reflection and doing nothing. A few hours later, No Hakjai returned and greeted our hero with such joy and surprise, as if he were an old friend, asking if everything was all right. Although a minute later, he added that with a wizard like him, everything must have been fine, and he had easily defeated his opponent. Responding to the young man's question about how the battle went and how he managed to win, the gray-haired man said it was a draw. Suddenly, the old man addressed our hero by name, which was strange enough in itself, and then asked how long he had left before the end of his service. The young man replied with some confusion that he had a little over a year left, and immediately asked why the old man was asking. After thinking for a moment, No Hakjai asked the young man to spend that time with him. After a while, the young man thought about how the mountain's mantra made an unusual sound. And because of this, other monsters absorbed the blood they shed during battle, which was a source of nourishment for it. Therefore, the young man watched the monsters closely and observed the flowers growing nearby. Lee Seaman watched the terrifying monster and the things that were being devoured at that moment, but not him. Rather smaller predators. After a moment's hesitation, the young man decided that it was now his turn to intervene. However, for a while longer, holding his sword behind his shoulder, the guy still watched what was happening closely. Having finished off all the monsters, the young man could finally breathe easy and take a short break, thinking that he would go about his own business. But a few minutes later, he discovered several more monsters not far from him. Pitting them against each other, the young man realized that he would be able to deal with them in no time. A few minutes later, our hero approached the mandrake, asking her why she was making so much noise. At that moment, the same monster he already knew was standing behind Lee Seaman again, but he ordered him to stay where he was. Turning around, the guy addressed the defeated predators and said that the two of them would have to follow him. Back at the camp, the old man asked him why he had been gone so long and why he was so slow. But the young man explained that he had not actually been gone for very long. Our hero immediately added that, judging by how quickly the old man's temper was deteriorating, it was difficult for him. But then he paused because he heard a strange sound, although he did not pay any attention to it. Pointing to the pot, the man sternly asked if the young man had found the mandrake, and heard that he had completed the task. After that, No Hakjai began to ask some strange questions, although the young man did not understand what he was talking about. Once again, with irritation in her voice, the old woman began to scold the young man, asking if he still hadn't understood anything important. The young man did not understand why his savior was picking on him so much, especially since they were not in the army. But the man did not answer the question. He only said that most likely these monsters understood that there was meat there. They realized their fate. Predators also feel the laws of nature. After a while, they had dinner and were ready to train again. Grabbing his sword, the young man asked his savior and mentor to help him with his training today. The young man knew that by hunting monsters, he was honing his skills through training. Interestingly, a whole year had passed in this way, although it would be more accurate to say that it had simply flown by. With each attack, Lee Seaman's attacks became more serious and professional. So much so that even the old man noticed it. And if at first the men were not on equal terms, by this time the young man was doing completely incredible things. A year ago, the guy was in the army, and before that, he was training in martial arts. But now the old man had a request for him. This proposal was quite strange, as the mentor wanted the young man to join him in blocking the gates of hell. But Hakjai calmly said that his student had learned too much. Parrying the blows, the young man honestly said that it was all thanks to him, as well as the old man's perseverance and his own. The mentor knew that with such skills, the young man would easily cope with the black mark. A few minutes later, complaining about his shoulder, the old man thought that it looked like rain was coming. The man knew that if they failed to close the gates of hell, evil demons would continue to crawl out of them, and then the world would be on the brink of destruction. Turning to the master, the young man paused for a moment, as if thinking about something. Hearing that there were only 2 weeks left, the man also thought for a moment, though he did not rush to say anything aloud. However, after a moment, he added that time had passed as quickly as possible, stating that the day would come when they would sit down for it, although he did not specify what exactly he was talking about. 2 weeks later, it turned out that everything was exactly the same, as the boy and his mentor slept peacefully, without thinking about anything. However, the young man suddenly opened his eyes and thought that the long-awaited day would come tomorrow, because that was when they would destroy the gate to hell, and he would be able to return home. The young man was sure that when he finally returned, there would most likely be many journalists who would want to interview him. The young man had even prepared a speech and knew what he would say about how every day was spent in despair. But he did not give up, using this difficult situation for his own purposes. And then the guy said that it was hard for him to believe that he had actually become a raider. For a moment, Lee Seaman fell silent as his memories took him far away. Ming Qiao stood before his eyes, and the young man remembered their first meeting, as well as the terrifying look in that man's eyes. For some reason, it seemed to him again and again that they were fighting, and the fight was extremely difficult for the guy. Taking a deep breath, Lee Se-min said the man's name aloud, but he didn't want to think about him anymore. The next day, going out into the street, the young man tightened his boots and tucked his pants into them. Then he began to put on his jacket, as if he was going somewhere. A minute later, standing in full combat gear with his sword on his shoulder, the guy proudly said that he was ready to go. At that moment, his master said that the young man now looked like a real soldier, and upon hearing this, he reminded our hero of a hermit. After that, the man handed his protege a strange button, similar to a car remote control, which caused the young man to be confused. Lee Se-min pressed this strange thing several times, but when he got no results, he said that it probably didn't work because he couldn't hear any sounds. Suddenly, there was a loud explosion behind the young man, and he smelled something burning. But Hak-jae explained to his protege that before the final battle, it was necessary to destroy the place where they could return. Looking at the fire, the old man said that they had nothing left to do here anyway, so it was time to get going. A moment later, he added that the battle would not wait, so it was better to start what they had been preparing for so long. The men sat on a hill and watched the base intently, thinking about how the enemy's defenses had become stronger. Lee Se-min believed that, if the old man's words were to be believed, the People's Army was conducting research on mass training of raiders using dark aura. Everyone knew that Pak Min-chol was originally an outstanding raider, but after his experience, he had turned into a real monster. If things were left as they were, it was quite possible that something terrible would happen. The man looked closely at the young man and told him to follow him closely and use the shadow step. Despite this, the young man did not quite understand how his mentor was going to deal with such a large number of guards on his own. Hearing that this was not a problem, Lee Se-min immediately began to talk about it so that he could prepare himself, but the old man said that the young man was making a fuss for nothing. At that moment, several soldiers were talking about how they also wanted to try using the dark aura, as it was an interesting and valuable experience. But in the next moment, jumping over the fence, No Hak-jae began to skillfully fight the ill-wishers, who were not expecting anything like this. That is why one of them began to shout that they were being attacked and should defend themselves. Within a few minutes, all the soldiers became prisoners of war, who seemed to have not even had time to realize what was happening. With his hands behind his back, the old man turned to his protege and said that they couldn't waste a minute, so they had to move forward. Inside were soldiers who were either quietly eating dinner or actively discussing something. Our hero, following his savior, wanted to sneak through this room as quietly as possible so as not to be noticed. Hearing the loud laughter of his opponents, the old man said that he had heard that today was the birthday of the new leader. The young man, in turn, said that he did not think that the North Korean leader would help him, hinting that at that moment almost everyone was relaxed and calm. At an interesting moment, our heroes found themselves on a large observation deck, where the master said that this place would be quite suitable. Sitting down, the guy immediately began to take out of his bag the mandrake that he had stocked up on the day before. Lee Se-min handed the plant to his mentor, although he did not know what he was going to do with it. For several minutes, No Hak-jae carefully observed the plant, squeezing it. A moment later, the mandrake let out a scream that nearly deafened the men. Our heroes immediately covered their ears, realizing that it was simply impossible for a normal, healthy person to hear it. Despite this, the sound continued to grow louder, and it was so strong that it seemed even a deaf person in the vicinity could hear it. Pushing the plant aside, the old man said that now they would have to act as quickly and cohesively as possible to achieve their goal. Still sitting there on the platform, Lee asked the master how he planned to stop this aura if it was so dangerous. Looking at the darkness in front of him, Lee Se-min said apprehensively that it seemed to him that this negative aura had become much denser than it had been before. The man did not answer the boy's question, but simply asked him to be quiet for a moment, saying that he was distracting him. At that moment, the soldiers were discussing the strange sound, not knowing that it had been made by the mandrake. But they knew that the monsters they were expecting any minute would react to it. Suddenly, one of the enemies spotted our heroes and shouted that there had been an invasion, but the old man ordered his student to jump down in time. The villain had already reported that 2 unknown individuals had been spotted in the western border zone and ordered all available military personnel to move there immediately. However, a moment later, the soldier fell silent, his eyes wide with fear. The young man watched intently as the huge monster looked at them with curiosity. Only a few minutes had passed, but the soldiers were already panicking, saying that the entrances should be blocked so that no predators could break through. The stranger crouched down and shouted for the junior officers to bring the commander here, as everything was getting out of control. Running as far away from the scene as possible, Lee Se-min praised his savior for what was most likely a clever plan that he had managed to pull off. As they approached their destination, the young man happily announced that they were almost there. At that moment, several enemies appeared before our heroes, who, despite the emergency, had remained to guard the shelter. The old man knew that there was no point in delaying the operation, so he used his signature trick, which allowed him to jump tens of meters. Thanks to this trick, the old man easily attacked one soldier after another, clearly intending to do something more serious. Gaining speed, our hero's savior thus took out one soldier at a time, each occupied by another. A few minutes later, having dealt with all his opponents, they were on the roof, and No Hak-jae turned to our hero. The old man was studying something intently on the floor, but remained silent. The young man knew that at such moments it was best not to interfere, because the master might be in a bad mood, and his answers would not be in the best manner. Time passed, but the old man remained seated, and our heroes remained silent, even though at that very moment he heard something extremely strange. It turned out to be the man they had met earlier in the forest, and he was extremely angry. Without saying a word, the ill-wisher immediately began to energetically attack the young man. Despite this, Lee Saemin was not going to give up. He knew that he had come here not only to fight, but also to win. However, suddenly the guy felt the powerful hand of his mentor hitting him on the shoulder. Our hero immediately understood that this man did not want him to enter the battle, and thus took him out of the game. Only a minute had passed, and No Hakjae was already sitting, holding his hands and telling his student to just hold on a little longer. Suddenly, a bright blue glow appeared, enveloping the arena and the surrounding area. Covering his face with his hands from the bright light, he asked what was going on and what this strange old man was doing. The man didn't like any of this, so he growled for the lunatic to slowly stop all this. Lee Saemin knew that he was the only one who could stand in the way of the enemy, while his savior did what he had to do, and what he was already doing. The villain, with anger in his voice, called our hero a puppy, and said that he had grown a lot since they last saw each other. The young man remembered a lot from that time, and his eyes showed sadness and hatred. So he confirmed the words of his detractor. Once again, the rival began to insult his opponent, saying that no matter how hard he tried, he would still not be able to defeat all the warriors at this base. The young man did not want to discuss this topic, so he focused his energy to such an extent that he threw the soldier in the other direction with the force of... The opponent clearly did not expect anything like this, because a second later he hit the wall with such force that multiple cracks appeared. Trying to recover, the man kept saying that this couldn't be true, that a soldier couldn't have such strength. Taking his sword, the villain said that he was most likely not dealing with a human being. But despite this, he was in no hurry to retreat. Lee Saemin continued to watch slowly, thinking about his next move. His opponent did the same, still unable to believe that he was facing a weak young man who had failed to become a raider. A moment later, heading towards his adversary, the boy shouted that he still had to finish what he had started. Then a battle began between two fairly strong opponents, each wanting to win. The commander did not like this situation because Lee Saemin skillfully delivered blow after blow, not giving his opponent a chance to act. It turned out that our hero had accumulated so much strength and energy that he could now fight with incredible tenacity. The young man did not try to end the fight. He knew that he needed to eliminate his opponent, who was holding up quite well. The man's strength was running out, but despite this, he also did not want to show his weakness. The man paused for a moment, clearly thinking through his next move, realizing that his opponent was as strong as he could be. Lee Saemin, in turn, said that he could not be defeated, that he knew what he was capable of, and therefore would stand his ground until the end. His opponent was also sure of this, and said that the guy should give up because he couldn't overcome the dark aura. Our hero had already met him. And then he said angrily that the commander was afraid, so much so that he could not do anything. Lee Saemin suddenly struck, believing that he would still be able to end this battle in the very near future. At that moment, his opponent shouted that he wanted to see how long the young man, who had already flown to the side, could resist him. It was indeed a powerful blow, so much so that the young man was even injured, although he had not expected anything like this. Lying on the ground, our hero knew that he had to get up and continue the fight, because the old man was preoccupied with his body and mind, and there was no time to wait. The young man thought again that they were in a death zone, where buildings were burning and monsters were rampaging everywhere. To deal with them, a stronger aura was needed. So the young man said that life is death, and death is life. It was extremely difficult for the young man, but he certainly did not want to stop for such a long and exhausting journey. Moreover, Lee Saemin thought that if you try to survive, you will die. But if you desire to die, then you will remain alive. Dispelling his aura, the young hero knew that he was strong, and with great desire, could do anything he wanted. After that, gathering his strength, the young man began to recite some kind of spell that dispersed not only his aura, but also his defenses with maximum force. The villain thought that he was only counting on dealing with this pathetic opponent, but he said aloud that no matter what, he would still be able to defeat Lee Saemin, who had proven to be too resilient. The young man did not want to prove anything to anyone. He simply concentrated on his own aura in order to strike. Within seconds, the rivals were locked in a fierce battle. It was difficult to say who would win, and the villain was angry that our hero had so much power. In turn, he asked in a sarcastic voice if he liked the taste of the ball from the southern lands. It was actually a powerful move, because in a moment, the villain's power threw him back. The young man watched his opponent closely, thinking about his next move, taking into account what Lee Saemin had already done. However, it was not only this that frightened the man. Seeing the bright stream of light, he reflected on how the old man had managed to perfect his technique, with which he could strike down his opponent. Among other things, he was surprised to see a huge dragon nearby, growling so loudly that it seemed as if it could deafen everyone present at any moment. The powerful beam of light was so bright that it spread throughout the entire camp. Seeing what was happening, the ill-wishers began to argue again and again, as if they had finally understood the old man's plan. The villain told someone to immediately send a signal to everyone. Behind the villain was a huge animal that seemed to be his reliable protection, but he did not particularly rely on it. The reason was that the man somehow absorbed the predator's energy so much that it dissolved into darkness. Looking closely at our hero, the villain shouted again and again that they had entered the most forbidden territory, and therefore they would have no peace, because he would destroy everyone anyway. The man had no intention of giving up, and even though he knew perfectly well that Lee Saemin was not the reason for what was happening, his greatest desire was still to get even with this particular guy. Running to the command post, one of the soldiers activated a lever. At that moment, a thick, strange liquid began to spill out from behind the boxes, and then something unimaginable began to happen, as it immediately flowed into the arena where the old man was sitting. Gradually, this liquid became darker and more viscous, now resembling the blackest aura that could possibly exist. The old man, who had been sitting in his place all this time, watched closely what was happening, but did not rush to interfere. However, after a minute, No Hak-jae reached for a small golden object, which he himself did not know where to put, and placed it in front of him. At the same time, the positive aura began to concentrate near the tablets that the old man had approached when they first arrived at this place. Standing in the center of this energy, the old man began to concentrate it in one object, focusing on its surface. It turned out that with each passing minute, our hero's savior was becoming stronger and more powerful. After a while, the man seemed to be standing on a huge energy ball, with some kind of thread falling from his hands into the center. A minute later, the old man remained in his place, while the ball grew even larger, although it was still under the old man. The danger was that the predators, responding to the signal, began to flock en masse to the place where our heroes were. Lee Se-min was still standing opposite his opponent, who was in no hurry to attack. The man did not understand what had happened, then asked, "Was he late?" At that moment, a soldier passing by shouted that they should leave immediately. Something began to happen to the monsters flying above the arena. It seemed as if dark energy was sucking in the light ball. Our heroes were seeing something like this for the first time, so they asked their savior what was happening to him, and if he was feeling well. Looking at his mentor in surprise, the young man couldn't believe that the master had been able to destroy the entire whole on his own. The young man dreamed that someday he could have similar energy and the same high level, although he did not believe in such a thing. At that moment, a terrifying demon appeared behind the old man, unwilling to miss the opportunity to take revenge on his enemy. Lee Se-min watched what was happening, but it turned out that he could do nothing in this case. Our hero watched the old man closely, who now stood with his back to them and simply remained silent. It was difficult to understand what the master was thinking at that moment, but the young man did not rush to ask him anything. He knew that this silence would last forever, as the master was focused and watching the setting sun. Lee Se-min realized that this was taking too long, so he broke the silence and asked how it happened that the old man began to live alone in such a strange place. The mentor said that it was due to mistakes in the past. He had acted immorally, deceiving others for his own well-being and for his own glory. At first, the young man did not want to listen to such things, but then he realized that this was how absolutely everyone lived, which he said aloud. After a short pause, the master replied that there were others, adding that, for example, the young man was now completely different from the person he had been a year ago. After looking at the short period of time, the old man admitted that this was indeed the case, as a lot had happened during that time. But Hak-jae noted that with the arrival of summer, and with summer comes autumn and winter, anyone can change if they want to. Then, with sadness in his voice, he added that there are things in the world that never change. Our hero wanted to know more about what those reasons were, but unfortunately, he couldn't remember anything else from their previous conversation. However, the young man had no doubt about one thing. He was sure that his mentor had become much stronger than before. With each passing minute, the dark energy enveloped the young man's savior more and more, and it seemed that he would hardly be able to get through it all, because the situation was heating up. That is why Lee Se-min instantly rushed to the place where his master and mentor was. Our hero's opponent knew that the most important thing was to deal with the old man, so he did everything possible to prevent the young man from coming to his aid. For a moment, the young man actually stopped, seeing everything that was happening behind him out of the corner of his eye. The young man did not want to just wait and watch, so he dealt with his enemies and went in the direction of his mentor. The old man's eyes showed a kind of emptiness and longing. It seemed that he no longer had the strength to fight. However, a moment later, the master shouted at his student not to even think about approaching him. Despite the fact that the young man was heading towards No Hak-jae, he did not need to do so, and therefore the old man turned to the young man once more and ordered him to run. Covering his ears with his hands, our hero understood that he could not disobey the master because he had thought everything through to the smallest detail. For this reason, Lee Se-min did what he was told his entire life, simply took off and ran, running faster and farther with every passing minute. It was interesting that somehow the young man could clearly see himself in the past, as if it were happening at that very moment. He knew perfectly well that people don't change, and what's more, he had met many who were kind to him. He recalled again and again how his family and friends wanted him to become a raider in order to protect the weak and disadvantaged. Then the images quickly changed one after another, but the young man did not understand what was happening in that place. For a moment, he saw a person who looked like himself, and yet he decided to fight the demon that was behind the old man. It was a terrifying creature, but despite this, Lee Se-min felt no fear, only unwavering determination. The young man knew that he had not just been practicing for a whole year, he had to use his own skills. Gripping his sword tighter for a moment, the young man told himself that there was nothing to be afraid of, and the aura seemed to dissolve. Moreover, looking around, our hero had no idea where he was, as there was nothing but emptiness all around him. Lee Se-min wondered where he was and what should be in this place. Our hero saw a bright light, but despite this, he continued to watch everything that was happening closely, as if he were observing something like this for the first time in his life. Then the guy noticed the silhouette of some strange person he had never seen before, and therefore did not know who he could be. The next second, the young man felt as if he were flying into an endless abyss. And so everything became even more confusing, because Lee Seaman thought he saw one big city. After that, the picture changed, and now he was observing beautiful nature reminiscent of a jungle. A moment later, strange lights appeared, and our hero continued to be in a state of prostration, flying somewhere. He had the feeling that he was somewhere in space and rapidly approaching planet Earth, although he knew that nothing like that could be possible. A moment later, the young man saw his mentor, who called him a real fool. It all seemed rather strange, especially since Nohak-jae was somehow magically standing quite steadily on the ground. Suddenly, the man approached his student, raised his hand to him, and told him to live. At that moment, it seemed to the young man that his mentor had pushed him with such force that he flew somewhere again, even faster than before. It seemed as if the world had gone mad, because the young man saw both the old man and the weapon he had released from his own hands in front of him. The most surprising thing was the unusual flight among the stars scattered like fine crumbs across the sky. Finally, it was all over, and now, instead of stars, Lee Seaman felt solid ground beneath him. Suddenly, the young man found the strength to open his eyes, and he realized that he was indeed lying on the ground, completely alone. Looking ahead, the young man realized that he was in a forest, carefully observing the starry sky. The guy wanted to say something, but he was in such shock that he couldn't believe what was happening. Moreover, he didn't understand how he could have ended up in this strange place. He didn't even know that behind him was a huge, friendly dragon. The young man understood only one thing. He was surrounded by a thick purple fog. 2 moons had appeared in the sky, and on top of everything else, strange plants were growing everywhere. Finally, for the first time in a long time, the young man smiled, and the reason was that he was now in a completely different world. It seemed that the dark era was over for him, because 3 years later, completely different events were unfolding. An unfamiliar young man entered the building of the SH company, which hired raiders, and politely greeted one of the employees. The employee did not understand why the young man had come so early, but the visitor explained that he had a habit of arriving ahead of time. Sighing heavily, the brunette said that there had been a lot of work lately, not a minute to rest, that progress had gone too far, and that was a big problem. A minute later, the briefing began, during which the lecturer said that signs of a gate had been discovered in the residential area of Anyang. And while the woman stubbornly talked about what was going on, the young people argued about who would get a green mark next month. The red-haired guy watched his colleagues, but remained silent, thinking about how raiders were no longer afraid of the gate at. Thanks to technological advances, the damage rate had been reduced. Moreover, it was decided to divide all raiders into ranks based on their level, so now everyone could choose a gate based on their level of preparation. Despite this, it is still impossible to foresee all the nuances that may arise during battle. There is always a chance of an unforeseen event. Suddenly, the lecturer turned to Han Jae-young and asked him if he wanted to take charge of the upcoming raid. Hearing that raids were always led by the most knowledgeable and experienced members of the army, he began to stammer, not knowing what to say. At that moment, other colleagues pointed out that there was nothing to be proud of, despite his experience, as the young man still had a blue mark. Another man stopped the lecturer and asked why this decision was not being discussed with the others, as if it were something unacceptable. Raider said that he had passed the test and would receive a green mark starting next month. So wouldn't it be better to entrust this matter to him? Smiling, the speaker immediately changed the subject, saying that in that case, Kim Dae-en would be appointed as the person in charge. After that, everyone unanimously agreed that they had no complaints, so let it be as decided. However, a minute later, the brunette whispered to Han Jae-yoon that this was generally wrong because experience was important, adding that the judging criteria needed to be reviewed. A few days later, the area that had been the subject of so much discussion was cordoned off, and only raiders were allowed in. Kim Dae-eun, sitting in the car, turned to his colleague and asked if it was true that his name was Han Jae-young. Shaking hands with the young man, the man introduced himself again and asked if he regretted being chosen as the leader. Hearing that the red-haired guy thought this was unfair, the man shook his hand again and remarked that from now on, they would have to work together and hope that they would get along. Glancing at the guys standing in front, his companion asked his new acquaintance what exactly one of the guys had said about him. Time was running out, so there was no opportunity for long conversations, and in a few minutes all the members of the group gathered in a spacious area. Turning to someone, Kim Dae-eun asked if there were any results yet. The man immediately reported that Jarg and Karg were presumably in the gorge. The level was high, there were many enemies, and therefore it was better to avoid buildings. The leader was not at all frightened by this news, stating that he would easily deal with the enemies, and suggested that the guys set off. At that moment, the system announced that there were only 10 seconds left before the gates opened. The young people listened attentively to the report, knowing that a battle awaited them afterwards. At that moment, a crack actually appeared in front of them, behind which a subspace began to open up. Everyone knew what it was, so no one felt fear or surprise anymore. Finally, the gate opened, and they had to be on their guard, because very often the first few minutes are the most difficult. This time, nothing unusual happened either, and the raiders saw a large number of predators in front of them, as they had been told before. The system noted that these were pest monsters. They had a system number, so they should deal with these creatures as quickly as possible and report the results. Heng Jae-young, who was standing closest to the entrance, immediately put his weapon forward, realizing that he had to act preemptively. A moment later, all the raiders, hearing the command, immediately rushed into battle, realizing that there were actually many enemies, but they were all weak. The raiders knew that weakness was not always a bad thing, because if they caught the enemy off guard, they would easily defeat them. The red-haired guy didn't wait a moment, and immediately entered into a battle that promised to be fierce. Only a few minutes had passed, and the young man had already managed to defeat one of the predators, although he understood that this was only the beginning. At that moment, another monster ran towards the guy, which he also intended to deal with. At that moment, Kim Dae-eun also rushed into the fight, realizing that he was the leader of this team, and therefore had to show the best results. Despite this, the raider objectively showed little. His colleague had stronger skills, and therefore the guy could be the commander of this group. Unexpectedly, the system issued a new notification that all team members should prepare for a second attack, as the next group of monsters was approaching. The commander was horrified and told the guys what they heard to avoid possible losses. And indeed, the next group was not long in coming. It seemed that there were even more monsters, and they looked even more terrifying. The guys were dealing with their opponents, but something unusual happened that made them all suddenly stop. Turning to the security group, Han Jae-yong, despite not being the leader, asked what had happened. The frightened men began to shout that for some unknown reason, the gates had suddenly enlarged, which was extremely rare and an exception. The young man who had taken on one monster shouted that this was an unforeseen situation, and that the predators would begin to spread too quickly. Continuing to hold back the onslaught, the guy asked for immediate reinforcements, otherwise they would not be able to hold back the breakthrough for long. However, Kim Dae-eun had a completely different opinion. He didn't understand why his colleague was so angry, and moreover, why he was asking for reinforcements. The raider continued to explain his point of view, saying that when something completely uncontrollable happens, anything can be expected. At that moment, the system sent a notification that the request for backup had been fulfilled. Once again, the team leader muttered discontentedly under his breath that the most important thing was to remain as calm as possible. Moreover, the raider was waiting for some kind of terrifying monster to appear in the passageway, which he could defeat, showing his best results. The young man craved adventure, so he lacked the extra thrill. But in a moment, something happened that no one expected. Kim Dae-eun was confronted by the monster leader Drake, whom he had never seen before. Compared to this monster, all the guys standing nearby seemed small and insignificant. Unfortunately, the hunters knew that only raiders with a gold mark or higher could fight such monsters after long training. At that moment, the red-haired guy turned his head, wanting to say something, but decided to wait. The reason was that their colleagues from the office, who were supposed to monitor the situation, had already settled into their cars and were about to leave. With a trembling voice, the leader said that they couldn't handle it alone, so it would be best to do the same as the others and just run away. Watching the raiders throw down their swords one by one, Han Jae-yong shouted loudly for them to pick up their weapons immediately. The young man realized that they had to hold out until reinforcements arrived, otherwise the ordinary citizens of the city would perish. Looking at the ominous monster, the group of raiders had no idea what to do to wait for help. However, the red-haired raider declared that they must all stand their ground until the very end, because the lives of innocent people were at stake. And if this Drake went any further, it would be very difficult to stop him. At that moment, the predator roared like never before, showing all its strength and power. The raiders had seen a lot in their lives, but it seemed that they had never encountered anything like this before, so they did not know how to react. Suddenly, someone turned to Drake and asked why he had suddenly stopped in the middle of the road. The stranger riding the beast shouted to the people standing below. It was Lee Seaman, who joyfully greeted everyone present, noting that he hadn't seen them in a long time. Turning to the red-haired guy, our hero asked what year it was. Hearing that it was now 2000, the young man opened his mouth wide, seemingly shocked by this information. And while the young man was thinking about where his youth and golden years had gone, Han Jae-yong thought to himself that they were standing in front of an unusual person. Hearing that the raider asked our hero where he came from, the young man noted that he had returned from the world beyond the gate, although he did not specify exactly where. After a while, the guy was already being checked on the computer, learning that there was no data on the young man. The guys from the company thought that he might not be registered as a raider, and some believed that the young man was from Japan, since he had just spoken in a similar language. A few minutes later, Lee Seaman was told that if he was a raider from another country, he would need to go to the office in person to verify his identity, but he would need to go there with someone. Pointing to his new acquaintance, the young man said that he wanted to go with him. Heng Jae-yonu did not understand this decision, but our hero explained that he felt a very strong spirit in him. Suddenly, Lee Seaman shouted that they had to hold out at all costs until reinforcements arrived. Otherwise, the ordinary citizens of the city would perish. But in a minute, the young man added, he wanted to be the one who was ready to fight to the end, alongside the raider who had raised his weapon. The red-haired guy bowed his head and said he agreed with that. After a while, the sports car was speeding through the streets of the city. When our hero asked if the car belonged to the raider, he replied that it was too expensive for him with a blue mark, so he took it on installment. Lee Seaman immediately noticed that his new acquaintance looked very serious and lived independently. After a while, the guy explained that he just wanted his girlfriend to trust him and be close to him. Our hero immediately began to say that this was actually commendable, and that buying a car on an installment plan was a great idea. Heng Jae-yun felt awkward hearing such words from a stranger, so he became embarrassed and said he would say no more. Lee Seaman began to justify himself and explained that he had been in a place where he had no one to talk to for too long, and suddenly he met people, so he wanted to communicate. A short time passed, and the guys were already in the control room, among other raiders. Opposite our hero sat two unfamiliar men who were watching him closely. At that very moment, a young man approached the red-haired guy in the lobby. He calmly noted that it was quite possible that this strange young man was telling the truth, which greatly discouraged the raider. The employee explained that this young man was most likely in the space outside the gate. Hearing his name, Lee Seaman found it extremely unusual, as no one had ever addressed him that way before. A minute later, the man reported that, according to his fingerprints, a person with that name had died long ago, and there was even a record of an accident that had occurred during the operation. Our hero heard everything they told him, but it was almost impossible to believe. The young man knew he should tell the truth, but for now, he started talking about the squad of immortals. Everyone knew that this was classified information, so only those who were in this squad could know about it. The employee, looking at our hero, said that once upon a time, there were those among the awakened who possessed special skills, but a special squad was formed from those who passed the test. The rest of the conversation remained within the walls of the interrogation room, and every time Lee Seaman opened his mouth to say something, the faces of the bureau employees became very frightened. In the hallway, one of the employees said that first, they needed to listen carefully to the young man's words, as they had a strict selection process. He added that during this time, the young man, who was not at home, could live with the raider, Han Jae-yong. The red-haired guy didn't like this idea, so he tried to prevent it in every way possible. Even though his colleague explained that the young man wanted to help his friend, Lee Seaman immediately turned on his acting skills, explaining that surely everyone would abandon him, leaving him to fend for himself and forcing him to sleep on the street. He added that surely they would not refuse to take him in, since he was a real hero who had nearly died while performing a task of national importance, but had returned alive. At that moment, Han Jae-yong said that they would certainly not abandon the young man in trouble and would help him. Patting the raider on the back, his colleague noted that he had been in battle and had shown himself in the best light. Just an hour later, the guys arrived at the apartment where the red-haired guy lived. The owner of the apartment immediately went to his closet, realizing that the young man would need something to wear. Picking up some underwear, the guy didn't hear his guest ask him to bring clothes as soon as possible. Our hero understood that he was being offered the clothes that the raider had been wearing, and although he didn't really want to wear them, the owner convinced him that they would soon go to the store and buy everything they needed. Returning the leopard print underwear to Han Jae-yoon, the young man asked if he really liked it, hearing that it was a gift. Through the door, the guy noticed that, considering that the raider had given him this item, it was most likely a gift from his ex. After getting out of the shower, our hero said that it was the best day ever because he had managed to have such a good bath. Throwing a towel around his neck, the young man sincerely thanked his new acquaintance for everything he was doing for him. Heng Ji-yeonu immediately noted that the young man finally looked like a human being, although the guy did not like such treatment. Our hero never went anywhere without his sword, so in this case, he left his weapon in the nearest corner of the room. Unexpectedly, the owner of the apartment asked if the young man needed to call anyone, perhaps his relatives. For a moment, a tense silence hung in the room. None of the men dared to say anything. It was clear that Lee Se-min was worried about something, and therefore did not know how to respond. After thinking for a moment and looking away, the young man said that of course he needed to. However, upon hearing that the young man was offering his phone, he said he would take care of it a little later. After that, Han Jae-yong got up from his seat and said that it was time to go. He immediately added that his new acquaintance should buy some clothes, although it would be good to go to the barber's as well. Our hero began apologizing again for causing so much trouble, although the red-haired guy said that the young man had helped them destroy the monster, which was a big bonus. Smiling, the young man said that was true, but he still wanted to contribute in some way. Grabbing his new friend, Lee Seaman said that he needed to buy clothes and shoes, and he would also like to order dinner, but not Korean beef. The young man understood that this was too much to ask, so he promised to teach his friend martial arts in return. Once again, our hero took the host by the arm, telling him not to worry, that he was just an emotional person, and was happy to be back. Only a few hours had passed, and the young man was already sitting in the barber's chair, listening to compliments about how beautiful his hair was. The stylist didn't understand why the guy wanted such a hairstyle, and thought that he might be a rock musician. However, the young man admitted that if Raider's job didn't work out, he would probably join a band. After that, the stylist began to wonder if it was true that Lee Seaman and his colleague worked together, and received a satisfactory answer. The young man answered her question sincerely, saying that he was a living person, and sometimes he was afraid to fight monsters, but Raiders learned to fight their fears. The hairdresser wanted to give him a good haircut, so she asked the client about the length and other details, but the young man completely trusted the stylist. Half an hour later, Lee Seaman saw a completely different young man in the mirror from the one he had been a couple of years ago. Handing him her business card, the girl said that next time the guy could make an appointment for a haircut himself by calling the number on the card. The young man had no money, so he turned to an acquaintance and asked him to pay for him. In just a moment, Lee Se-min literally flew out of the beauty salon like a bullet. The reason was that, for some inexplicable reason, the guy had bought a whole subscription, explaining it with his recent victory over Drake. Glaring at the hero's back, Han Jae-yong said irritably that if he became like that, he could do whatever he wanted. Pointing at something, The red-haired guy asked his friend if he had really decided to buy such a bright outfit. It was strange that Lee Se-min was trying on a bright jacket with a gold patch depicting a dragon in khaki pants. Since the young man liked it, he happily said that it was the best outfit he had ever had. Stunned, Han Jae-young asked his friend to choose just one thing, although he himself did not understand how this was relevant. The young man, who was even more angry, shouted that the young man should look like a normal guy, not like a dressed-up rooster. Walking down the street, our hero was upset that he was only allowed to keep one jacket. Lee Se-min said resentfully that he couldn't give up all 3 items. Hearing his new acquaintance forbid him from shopping alone in the future. Pointing to a restaurant, the young man suggested going in to eat something, but his companion said that he needed to go somewhere else. Looking ahead, the guy added that he needed to fix something. Raider suggested that his guest simply buy a new sword, although the latter began to explain that a weapon is the most important thing a hunter has. Only a few minutes passed, and our heroes had already arrived at some building. Several employees bowed and greeted the guys at the service center. Our hero said that he needed to have his weapon repaired as soon as possible. To avoid unnecessary questions, Lee Se-min immediately placed his sword on the counter. The administrators carefully examined the sword, thinking to themselves that it was in terrible condition. In addition, this model had long been discontinued, so it was unlikely that it could be restored to proper condition. It was strange for young people to see a guy who owned a sword, even though, judging by all appearances, he had used cold weapons in many battles. Hearing the young man being offered something newer and more comfortable, he declined the offer, saying he wanted to repair his blade. Lee Se-min noted that it would be difficult for him to understand this decision, because for him the sword was not just a weapon, but a companion that he had not been able to take care of, but planned to use in the future. A little later, the young man asked again for someone to take care of his blade, adding that it was really very important. The employees looked closely at the sullen young man standing in front of them, wondering how they could help him. They understood that they were dealing with a young man with old-school experience, so they wanted to please him in some way, saying that they would take on the job. A minute later, they added that they would do everything possible and that he could come back in a week, but they did not mention payment. A few minutes later, the guys got back in the car and went about their business. Pointing to his empty hand, the young man said that he was not used to being without his sword, giving the impression that he had left it somewhere. His friend said with understanding in his voice that there was nothing strange about that, since the young man had not been without his weapon for 3 years. Pointing to the large, luxurious table, Han Jae-young asked if his friend really wanted to eat pork or perhaps something else. With sadness in his voice, the young man said that he did not want beef because he had eaten enough of it outside the house. The guy explained that it wasn't exactly ordinary beef, but a certain variety of it, so it wasn't much different from the other kind. Suddenly, Lee Se-min heard someone address his friend sitting across from him. It was a young girl who addressed Hwang Jae-young and asked what he was doing here if he was planning to go somewhere and eat something delicious. At that moment, the stranger said her name was Kim Yeona and that she had heard a lot about our hero, who immediately began to justify himself, explaining that he was grateful for being taken in. The young man was sure that he was in the way, but the girl noted that she had just stopped by because she was nearby. Hearing the raider worry about her outer clothing, Kim Yeon said irritably that he should not bother her. The young man offered his acquaintance at least his coat, but she left the establishment shouting. After bringing the girl back, Han Jae-young put his coat on her and said it would be much better. The next morning, our hero got up quite early, as it was not yet 7 o'clock. First, he looked around carefully, as if he was interested in something specific. Getting up from his seat, the young man saw a computer on the table and realized that it was exactly what he didn't need. Sitting at the table, the young man realized that he hadn't visited his forum in so many years, and didn't know if he still had access to it. Lee Se-min hoped to be able to talk to those he had communicated with before or find out some information. Imagine his surprise when he saw system notifications saying that they were glad to see him, asking why he hadn't visited the site for so long, and also pointing out that he was a deserter. In fact, the young man even began to cry. He couldn't believe that he had managed to log into the site again. Just a few seconds later, our hero began typing on the keyboard. The young man briefly told his story about how he had fallen into a strange dark tunnel and wandered there alone for a long time. But thanks to his faith, he managed to get out. Lying in his bed, the owner of the apartment wondered if Lee Se-min had woken up yet. However, when he found the young man sitting at his laptop, he thought that the young man had scared him again, although such behavior was typical for him. Watching Lee Se-min, he understood what had happened to him and why he was so upset, thinking that the gate had greatly affected his psyche. Leaving these moments behind, our hero began to train, realizing that this was the most important thing, without which no raider could be called such. A moment later, the guy returned to his laptop because he had received a message. Smiling, our hero cheerfully asked the owner of the apartment where the knife was and asked him to bring it. Han Jae-yoon found it difficult to understand why the young man was talking to a dark screen, but he kept asking for the knife again and again. Suddenly, the owner of the apartment began to hug his guest with tears in his eyes, asking for something that he himself had thought of. To clear up any misunderstanding that the guy wasn't losing his mind, he changed the subject and asked if the raider had any challenges. Heng Ji-young immediately said that there were no raids, but there was work to be done because various tasks had piled up. Hearing this, our hero said that the young man should urgently reconsider his views, adding that they had agreed that he would teach the raider martial arts. Running up to his new friend, the host began to thank him, hearing the question about where they train. After a while, the guys were already in the raider's underground training hall, and the young man was explaining how to use the aura, as he had been taught. Handing the guy a notebook, Lee Seaman said that it would definitely come in handy. The young man understood this, but our hero explained that he had received the notebook from the person who had saved his life. The raider did not understand why a person he barely knew would give him such a valuable thing, thinking that it was wrong. Turning his back on his new friend, Lee Seaman said that the guy had also helped him a lot, but it was better not to talk about it. Our hero thought that he had found a trusting friend and decided that, in time, he would demand much more from him. The mentor in the arena told the raider that he should try something simple first, to understand his approximate level. Heng Ji-young thought it might be dangerous, but the master calmly said that even if his hit him with all their might, he would not be hurt. Looking at his new acquaintance, the young man reasoned that this guy had defeated Drake single-handedly, so he must have at least a gold mark. However, looking at this young man, the raider suddenly wondered if he was perhaps praising him too much. When asked by Han Jae-yoon about defense, the coach said that he would not need anything like that. Spreading his aura, our hero asked his opponent to start the fight, realizing that they had already delayed this moment. Raider watched his opponent closely, waiting and hoping to find the young man's weak spots. A moment later, Han Jae-young grabbed his spear and rushed towards the young man. However, our hero dodged so quickly that neither man immediately realized what had happened. The most interesting thing was that with each new movement the raider made, his mentor moved faster and faster, seemingly at a speed that even the wind could envy. Irritated, Han Jae-young did not understand how the young man managed to dodge so quickly, and moreover, he did not understand why he did not engage in combat. Although the battle continued, it seemed that there was no end to it because one constantly attacked and the other dodged. Suddenly, Lee Seaman said that his student was moving quite well, which shocked him. However, a moment later, the raider complimented our hero, saying that he remained strong. When his comrade doubted him, the young man began, albeit jokingly, to show that he should not be treated that way. The young man believed that he had little aura and simple movements, but his mentor said that the reason was not the size of the aura, but the fact that it was being used incorrectly. Heng Jae-young heard something like this for the first time, so he thought that the guy already had his advantage. Raising his hand, the mentor explained that aura and will are one and the same, and that movement is more integrated with the aura. This is a special connection that the best masters know about, and what's more, they control it perfectly. He added that if a raider is particularly skilled at controlling aura, then the problem is not its magnitude. The quickest emotion is the urge to kill, so the coach suggested that the guy attack again, but this time thinking about how he wanted to destroy his opponent. A few minutes later, the order was carried out, and this time something changed in his behavior. Despite this, no matter how many times the young man attacked, Lee Seaman managed to dodge him again and again. The student did not want to appear weak and powerless, so he did everything he could. After a while, Han Jae-young fell to the ground as he was so tired that he wanted to rest a little longer. Our hero, who thought of himself as a great master, said that it was shameful to hear such talk about a traitor. So he told the young man to get up immediately. The guy, who was barely standing on his feet, asked the young man how he could be in such great shape and not even sweat. However, Lee Seaman noticed that the reason was not the young man, but the fact that he wanted to train as hard as possible. Suddenly, several people entered the training room and addressed our hero's student by name. Raider explained that they were his co-workers, who were clearly preoccupied with something. The young people asked in horror what had happened, since their colleague had the day off. However, the irritated young man stated that it was not his problem, but the problem of those who had interrupted the class. After that, a strange argument began between Han Jae-young and the red-haired girl. The beauty again scolded the young man sitting on the ground, who still did not understand what had happened. The man standing behind the employee wanted to say something, but clearly did not dare to interrupt the discussion. A moment later, the colleague decided to show the young man a video depicting his girlfriend with two strangers. While the beauty explained that these two were powerful raiders, Han Jae-young wondered in bewilderment what was so strange about the video. Suddenly, something unexpected happened. The colleague began to beat our hero's student while he was trying to dodge one of the raiders. The man proudly said that he had heard about Lee Se-min and admired the young man and what he had done. Extending his hand to the young man, the employee introduced himself. It turned out that his name was Park Jong-won, and he was a blue-marked raider in this company. A few seconds later, the raider added that the girl's name was Yang Hyun-hwa, and that they were all on the same team. A moment later, our hero received an invitation to lunch, which made him very happy. Hearing that it was time for a snack, the beauty took a break from her class for a moment, and asked where they were going. Lying on the floor of the gym, Han Jae-young could barely stand and silently begged them to wait for him. Handing our hero his business card, the man said that he was the head of SH Company, and his name was Yoo Sang-hyun. Everyone gathered began to bombard the young man with questions about how he lived outside the gates and what he saw there. The raiders knew that there were probably many predators there, but they had no idea how scary and high-level they were. The young man thought for a moment, then began to tell them that every day in that place was like a real hell. The guy had to fight creatures he had never encountered before, and in the cold and hunger, he was forced to survive somehow. Once, while looking at his reflection in the water, another monster crept up on the young man. Hearing that our hero did not belong to any society because he was in the army, the director offered him a job. Yoo Sang-hyun noted that he was not calling the young man to service right away, but if he needed a job, he could always fight on behalf of their organization. At that moment, Lee Se-min thought again as he remembered the king of mercenaries. The young man did not want to go into details, so he proudly declared that he would do everything possible for this company. The cheerful employee shouted that since the young man had been hired, An initiation ceremony should be held to make him feel like a full member of the organization. Smiling slightly, Lee Simon said that even though they were born at different times, they were now all members of the same team. The young people were happy to hear this, so they got up from their seats and began to smile. Encouraging the boys, Lee Seaman said that now they were united and should always stand up for each other. After a while, the events moved to the Raider Academy. One of the employees began to ask if it was true that Major Lee Gilhan had attacked first during the fight when our hero lost consciousness. When the young man regained consciousness, he realized he was in prison, and it turned out to be true. When asked how he ended up behind bars, he began to lie, saying that he had heard about some experiments on people, after which he was pushed somewhere. And when he opened his eyes, he found himself in another world. Lee Simon knew perfectly well that he had to hide everything that had happened to the old man. Moreover, during this time, the young man had become a kind of psychologist, and from the faces of the people sitting opposite him, he understood that they also knew about the gates of hell. A few minutes later, the men noticed that almost all of the young man's comrades had died in battle, with only Major Kim Kyu-chun and Corporal Yoon Woo-jae remaining alive. The officers did not tell him where these people were now. They were interested in how our hero had lived behind the gates. The young man knew that he didn't have much to tell, because every day he fought and killed and thought little about anything else. Despite this, Lee Se-min did not give up or despair. He fought until one day something unexpected happened to him. One day, while fighting Drake, he discovered that the gates had opened, and the young man somehow managed to return to his world. Saying goodbye to the young man, the men said that they should check all the information. But if he remembered anything about the rare monsters, he should contact them. Hearing that Lee Se-min had signed a contract and was not allowed to tell anyone about it, he was horrified to realize that several people already knew about the events. Smiling, one of the men said that he should be more careful in the future, otherwise the young man would be in trouble. He added that the young man would be mobilized as soon as he restored his army documents, and that he was entitled to a medal, but that would not happen yet. In addition, he would receive a Raider certificate without additional tests as a bonus. Although it was only a blue mark, he could take the promotion exam in 6 months. Upon hearing this, Lee Se-min immediately asked if he could find out something. A moment later, he asked what the purpose of the entire expedition he had participated in was. However, the young man heard the same thing, namely that this task was a secret. Walking down the street, the young man said once again that it turned out that this question was closed, although he immediately added that everyone can have their secrets, and therefore he saw no point in knowing more about it. After buying a cell phone, our hero began to write to his friend that his documents had not yet been restored, but his friend's card had helped. Looking at the phone screen, Lee Se-min decided that his friend was offended, although he did not understand why. A moment later, the young man dialed a number and pressed the call button, although it seemed to be difficult for him. At that moment, our hero remembered standing with his parents, who told him that he should become a raider to serve others. The young man was tormented by the thought that his parents probably thought he was dead, and therefore did not know how to tell them the truth. For a while, the guy stood motionless, thinking about something. In the evening, Lee Se-min left the convenience store, but suddenly froze in his tracks. The reason was that our hero saw his friend telling someone how they had trained together. The young man was so absorbed in his own conversation that he didn't even notice that his mentor was behind him. Although Han Jae-young said over and over again that his friend, although he had no mark, was definitely stronger than the directors because he did completely incredible things. A minute later, after saying goodbye, the raider was already looking intently at his phone. A moment later, he saw someone handing him a bottle of soda. Looking at his mentor, the young man asked in surprise when he had managed to approach him. Without answering the question, our hero asked his colleague why he had suddenly decided to become a raider. After taking a sip, Han Jae-young admitted honestly that he needed to work somewhere, and also needed to make a living. But Lee Se-min, speaking for himself, explained that he once wanted to live according to his own name. After that, the guy asked if the raider loved his girlfriend, and upon hearing a satisfactory answer, and immediately, the young man asked a counter-question about what the young man would say if he found out that she was seeing other people behind his back. With sadness in his voice, the guy explained that he himself knew that this was the case, that the beauty was only dating him because he was a raider. He then said that she had had a difficult childhood, so she had always dreamed of something like this, and therefore she could not be blamed for it. Lee Se-min didn't want to continue this conversation because he didn't understand his friend, so he said that special training would be waiting for them the next day. The frightened raider did not understand what this meant, so he began to worry about some marks, hearing that such things should be forgotten altogether because they meant nothing. A day later, as agreed, the guys met again in the training hall to move on to the next level. Our hero began to gather mana in his hands, although he did not tell his protege what he was going to do. Transferring mana to his student, he thought that this was a completely normal state, in which the total volume of the aura was residual, but the efficiency was too low, and the circulation was not quite smooth. Frightened, Han Jae-young again could not understand what to do, but the young man told him not to be afraid and just follow him. Realizing that something was wrong, the raider asked if it was true that this was a darkening technique. The mentor said that one should not view this negatively, that the most important thing is harmony and balance, clarity and cloudiness, all of which are part of the world. If you control only one type of aura, you soon risk losing your balance. A few minutes later, Lee Se-min added that the young man should not stop and should continue training, although he did not say that it was time for him to work. A few minutes later, our hero came to the company director to receive some kind of assignment. Responding to this man's question about raiders, the young man explained that he had graduated from a well-known school and was an excellent student among the graduates. And while the man was looking at some documents, the young man confirmed once again that this was the absolute truth. Handing Lee Seaman a map, Yu Sang-hyun explained that a gate would open in the marked place, from which monsters called monkeys would appear. They were a subspecies, but instead of fur, they had scales and enough strength to instantly tear off a person's arms. They were very agile, and could easily break through a siege and escape. The director, hearing that the young man agreed, said that compared to the level of difficulty, the reward was quite low. So many people refused. However, the young man shouted that if it was a matter of saving lives, what was there not to like, adding that the others simply had the wrong attitude. After a while, a car was already speeding down the road, intending to park next to the library. When the car stopped, our hero's leg appeared from it. The young man was full of inspiration and energy, and therefore joyfully greeted all the guys gathered there. He said he represented the Monster Extermination Department, a monster slayer and creator of magic crystals, then gave his name and said he hoped to work with them. Everyone present looked at each other in disbelief that this was what a raider looked like, although there should be no doubt about it. The red-haired girl studying the guy thought that some strange hunter had arrived. A few minutes later, a briefing on the special operation began, during which they started talking about the enemies they would have to face. And while all the raiders listened to the lecturer, our hero closed his eyes and fell into a trance, because he found it all extremely boring to listen to. Hearing that there was still half an hour left before the gates opened, Lee Seaman thought that it would not be soon, and holding his sword, the raider standing next to him reasoned that as soon as the gates opened, they would do their job. She said that, thanks to her sword, she would do everything possible to prevent the predators from breaking through the cordon. Our hero, watching the girl's monotonous activity, began to yawn because he was actually bored. At that moment, the beauty said that there was only half an hour left before the gates opened, and asked if the young man was going to put on protective gear. However, with calmness in his voice, he replied that he had nothing of the sort, which shocked the girl. Smiling, he honestly admitted that he never used anything like that because protective gear simply got in his way. The beauty thought to herself that she was dealing with some kind of loser, but asked aloud how it was possible to work as a raider without protective gear. Hearing this, the guy enthusiastically declared that she shouldn't worry about him because he was fine. In order not to disappoint the red-haired beauty, Lee Seaman explained that he would try first, but if he felt danger, he would immediately leave the scene. He added that if the raiders sighed so sadly every time, he would fail. Hearing that there were only seconds left before the gates opened, our hero thought about how to quickly finish off these monsters. The raider standing next to him and watching his face asked him to focus on them and on himself, like a true professional. Suddenly, the system announced that the gates had opened and all hunters should be ready. A moment later, the guys were looking at the predators, who clearly did not like this state of affairs. The young people fearfully grabbed their weapons, ready to engage in combat at any moment. Within seconds, many of the raiders were already desperately fighting the predators. It seemed that these people didn't care who wanted to attack them. Suddenly, one of the monkeys rushed forward, leaving the hunters behind. The female raider shouted to her colleagues that one of the monsters had jumped out, so she wanted to go back and deal with it. It turned out that this enemy had lightning speed, as it was running so fast that it was difficult to keep track of it. Our hero, who was a little behind the group, had already noticed this monster and understood where it was headed. The young man knew that he had to act decisively, just as he had done all these years. Grabbing his sword, the young man thought to himself that if he didn't destroy his enemy would destroy him. And so, in a moment, Lee Seaman rushed forward toward the enemy, who was running straight into their arms. The young man thought to himself that he had finally made friends with fear, and something new had reached out to help him. It was the indifference of a butcher when he had to kill those who wanted to live. The novice raider, as many considered him, dealt with monsters so quickly that the others couldn't believe it was even possible. The red-haired girl thought with horror that this young man definitely did not have a blue mark, because he was stronger than all of them put together. Not much time had passed. The battle was already over, and the guys praised each other for a job well done. Suddenly, the raider approached our hero and spoke to him. Hearing the young man's sarcastic remark that he hadn't come up with an autograph yet, the beauty said she understood what he was talking about. But she added that she knew very well that the guy was very talented. But despite this, he still had to follow strict rules. Hearing Lee Seaman talk about equipment, the beauty said that it was not about him, but about the label, and that there was no need to pretend to be better than everyone else, making others look foolish. The young man, showing his blue badge, said that he had not actually deceived anyone, since it was his first time on a raid. Our hero's colleague looked closely at his ID, trying to understand what it was all about. Stammering, she apologized for yelling at the guy, and said that his skills were not really like those of a blue badge. Still smiling, our hero said that he could imagine how surprised the raider was, and added that, without realizing it, she had become his fan.